Yeah, Brian, you can continue talking about your cheesecake story.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, actually, you know what? You probably shouldn't talk about that cheesecake story. That's not
Some
something
other
that people
crazy
should hear.
person
It's
might
not.
be
It's not
strongly
something that people
adverse
should
to
hear.
you.
Yeah. So we should be live now. Welcome everyone. Brandon just told me the most horrific story I've ever heard.
It's not that bad.
It's pretty bad. He had
Oh,
cheesecake in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
Except it was not cheesecake. It was disgusting.
The cheesecake had slightly turned. It tasted fine. It tasted really good actually, but it had a slight bit of blue tinge on the top, and it did not make me feel very good. But other than that, I was fine. And Andres over here being a pussy, acting like it's the grossest thing he's ever heard in his life.
You're gonna get me demonetized.
Is that a demonetizable word?
Maybe.
Who knows?
So
I mean, don't certain types of cheeses have mold on them by default, right?
That's true.
Yeah, that
And it is
It's added a little bit of
cheesecake.
flavor to it, you know. It's
short
aged
cheesecake. All right, we're gonna stop talking about moldy cheesecake. Welcome everyone. This is the On Just Restart podcast. I am joined by Brandon, who's usually around, and I'm also joined by Don, who's from Monster Maze. If you like Zelda, you may have seen his channel before. It's a pretty damn good Zelda channel, and it is linked in the description below. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. Thank you for that introduction.
Of course.
Yeah, I've been busy doing a lot of research. I got a few videos in the work, so that requires a lot of stuff that I need to look into.
Yeah. No, yeah, guys, if you haven't seen his channel before, definitely check it out. Like, he puts a lot of time and research, and it's scripted, and there's a lot of, like, visual effects that go into it. Yeah, his works are legit productions, and they are also pretty insightful and interesting as well. So, like, definitely check it out. For sure. I mean, some of them, you know, I think are pretty good foundations for some good Zelda theory discussion, which is, by the way, the entire point of tonight's discussion, right? We've been meaning to kind of do one for this year. I mean, we always like jump to Zelda theory like randomly all the time, but like this is an actual like Zelda like theory discussion podcast. And I figured now would be as good of a time as any. We're really close to E3. There's not really enough news right now. There's a couple rumors, whatever, but nothing like I think that's worth like a whole podcast. And yeah, I like talking about Zelda, so I thought this would be a great time to do it.
I'll just pull up the chat real quick so I can see what people are talking about.
I'd pull up the chat, but I'd disable my camera, so.
That's all right. I can read it to you, Brandon. So yeah, on that note, let's say hello to the chat, and then we'll just jump into. I mean, the sky's the limit here, really.
Literally.
Okay. Yeah. Though I wasn't trying to be on the nose about that, but it kinda. Anyway, let me get into the chat here. So, David Haney, hello there. You're gonna get on the Zelda hype train for sure. Gone Hunter, hello. Crazy Scoff, hello there. Marco Martins, please. Yeah, Don is here. Absolutely. Natsu, how are you? JR Toki, Zelda Schmelda, let's theorize about Untitled Goose Game. Well, let me raise you Untitled Groose Game.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Peace was never an option.
No. I would actually love it if they were to revisit the story of Groose at one point. I don't know if they will, but it would be pretty cool.
Groose was such a fun character.
I honestly thought that was kind of a missed opportunity in the manga, the Skyward Sword manga. They didn't really do much, I think. That was one thing they could have highlighted.
Yeah.
Even though it's not really canon, but you know, still.
So, fill me in on I don't even remember that. Like, I remember there being like a story about the hero before Skyward Sword and the goddess, but is that the comic you're referring to, or is there something else?
Yeah, no, I think there's only one comic made by what is his name again? Akira Himeyake or something. I forgot his name. and even if I did, I would probably still pronounce it wrong. But like most of his comics are considered not canon because they're basically retellings of already pre-existing stories. So like just the story of Ocarina of Time, but like an alternate version of it.
Like I do remember like there's this. Yeah, I'm assuming that's where I've seen like these panels from, right? I just never like, you know, I haven't read it like continuously, but like I've seen like those panels of like Link and like the baby Volvagia. That was actually good. Yeah. There's quite a lot. He made a alternate version of Link to the Past story as well, and probably a lot more than I even know. I actually have one of them here. This is the Ocarina of Time one.
Oh, nice.
Epic. It's legendary, actually.
I like that.
Yeah, it's really awesome. Like the old beginning section is all colored.
That's beautiful.
Stuff like that.
I wish really Discord didn't display this where I couldn't see anything, hardly.
But you can see it actually starts with him sleeping and when he meets Navi for the first time. So it's basically just the story of Ocarina of Time from the very beginning.
But retold.
The same story but retold in a fan fiction kind of way.
So that's interesting though, because cool. now I feel like kind of reading through them because I feel like one of the issues is when people sort of talk about like Zelda and maybe becoming like an episodic series or like a movie is like how do you translate the Zelda experience to a cinematic experience, right? And I mean,
that's a tough one.
But those comics are doing it though.
Yeah, they kind of are. And the Skyward Sword comic is actually one of a few, or maybe the only one that actually tells a separate story. Like it's a prequel to Skyward Sword, like
which
how
is a prequel to everything else, which is hilarious, but. You know,
a prequel to the prequel. But it tells the story about I think the relationship between Link and Zelda, but also the part where Skyloft rises up to the sky for the first time. Like that part kind of I haven't read the whole thing, but I am currently doing a video on Zelda literature, and which stories can be considered canon, like everything that's printed, so even the manuals and stuff like that. So it's mostly a video about canonicity of things besides the video games. So like obviously the Zelda cartoons are not canon, but they are very fun in my opinion.
So but I'm pretty sure I know your opinion on this because I think you've talked about it in your videos before, but there's been debate about this. I always kind of see it come up in the comments. I'm just kind of would like you to shed some light on this, right? So there's this debate about Age of Calamity being canon or not. Now, I know the Zelda team did oversee some elements of Age of Calamity. So does that make it canon or does it make it non-canon? Because it's still not made by the Zelda team entirely either. It's made by Koei Tecmo.
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult one. Like for the first Hyrule Warriors, we know for sure that Aonuma said like it takes place in its own separate universe. So it doesn't take place in the main Zelda canon, so to speak. So it exists in its own little bubble. I guess you could say the same thing about Age of Calamity because it's also a separate timeline. It doesn't really affect the timeline of Breath of the Wild much.
Right.
If you really think about it, because some people say, well, what about those new champions like Sidon and Yunobo and stuff like that? Like, aren't they from Breath of the Wild's timeline? And well, we actually don't really know. They could also be from the future of Age of Calamity's timeline.
That's an interesting point too, because like it is like a divergent timeline. So in theory, they could become champions in that timeline, but not the timeline that we're going to be playing in the sequel. But, you know, I feel like we probably even had this discussion when Age of Calamity came out a couple of years ago. We probably talked about, like, what could Age of Calamity maybe be teasing about Breath of the Wild 2. And it wouldn't be... I feel like we probably did at least consider the possibility that the champion successors, that was maybe a tease towards that, right? Like, the character development of, Sidon, was it Riju? Yeah, Riju... Yeah. Yunobo and Teba, thank you. So like it's possible that when Breath of the Wild 2 comes around, we're gonna see them maybe even donning the champions like, you know, little ribbon scarf thing, and they're gonna be kind of like, you know, more developed
Yeah,
We'll see.
because you would think that if they were indeed the same ones and they want to make it a canon story, then technically speaking, in Breath of the Wild 2, when you meet Sidon, he should be like, yo, you're not gonna believe what I just experienced. But like I said, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be those same champion successors. They could also be from Age of Calamity's timeline, because obviously we're dealing with time travel, so it gets very complicated very quickly. But like the timeline of Age of Calamity would have ended the same way had it not been for Terrico, pretty much. So the Sidon we see, for instance, the Sidon we see in that story could be from the future, the future that would have been in Age of Calamity's timeline, and not the Sidon from Breath of the Wild's timeline. So, you know, it could exist in its own little separate bubble, and you could say, well, even if it is canon, it doesn't have any merits on any of the other games. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter, you know. I prefer if they just come out and say if it's canon or not, and if it has any impact, to be honest, because it would make stuff a lot more easier for people. Because not everybody liked the story direction of Age of Calamity, but if it's its own separate little thing, then it's harmless, you know.
Yeah. And my take is fairly similar to yours. I feel like because it does go back in time, it becomes its own separate reality. So all the events that transpire are entirely inconsequential to Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2. Like, they don't actually impact the main timeline or the main timelines. But it could also still technically be canon. It's just in its own pocket of space-time or whatever you want to call it. So it doesn't really matter.
It's canon in its own universe. It's just not canon for the rest of the universe and the main canon.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think that would be the best solution in this case. It makes everybody happy because it still happened in its own universe, so you can take it as headcanon, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Now,
but it's not gonna affect anything in Breath of the Wild. I prefer it that way, to be honest, because I'm generally not a huge fan of time travel in video games or any story for that matter, unless it's a core part of the like. Obviously, you cannot have like a story like Terminator without time travel, because the whole story of Terminator is based on time travel. But Zelda has always been a bit like, it toys with the idea, but it doesn't go too far with it. Because when you really think about it, like, I've had this with spoilers for Umbrella Academy, but Umbrella Academy kind of, for me, was the moment where I stopped being interested in the show, was when they suddenly introduced time travel, like in the second or third season, I believe. And it's like, well, if they can time travel, then any consequence goes out the window. There's no more feelings of, oh, if they all die, they can just go back in time and just redo the whole thing again. You know, it takes away any responsibility for the future.
You know, to that point, though, I'll say from a narrative standpoint, I do like the concept of time where, and obviously there's different stories that deal with time in different ways, right? But I prefer it when they deal with time as in, when you go back in time, you're creating an entirely different timeline, or you're going to an entirely different timeline. So if someone does die, right, or something does happen in a particular timeline, there is finality there, right? That's it. But perhaps in another timeline, based effectively another parallel universe, it's different. But it's not that you reverse time, it's just a different one.
Time travel would prove multiverse theory. A lot of people think that, because if you traveled back in time, if you were in your own universe, you would have already been documented traveling back in time, because it would have already happened, because you did it in the past, because you traveled back to the past. So you must have gone to a different universe where you didn't do that, essentially. So it's all very
it's the only way it would be. Yeah, it's the only way it would be possible, because any normal, like back to the future type of time travel, where it's just one timeline, everything you do creates a paradox, pretty much.
Mhm.
Like if you go back in time and kill your own mom, then you wouldn't exist. But in order to kill your mom, you have to exist. So it's like, error, glitch in the system. It doesn't work. So yeah, the multiverse theory is the only way to go in that regard. And like I said, Zelda never really went all too far with it, which is why it's harmless. Like obviously, I cannot imagine Ocarina of Time without the time travel. It's an integral part of the story, but it doesn't affect anything outside the timeline split. Obviously is there, but like other than that, like Link doesn't go back and prevents Ganon from ever being born or something like that,
Yeah.
It's more...
I like to think of it as kind of like a light world, dark world sort of thing, where Link's going back to another time, or he's going to the future. It's, back and forth. Both times exist, though, and because they're linked, kind of like maybe, for example, in Twilight Princess, how there's the Twilight world and the normal world, they're linked, right? Or like in Link to the Past, there's the light world and the dark world, right? It might be a different name for them, but there's two different realms, but they're all linked. Yeah. So I feel like in Ocarina of Time, it's basically the same thing. They just describe it as a 7-year gap. And that's how, in my head, it kind of makes sense when Link does something in one time that changes in the other. It's only because those two times are basically effectively just like two connected realms, and so they can kind of be interchangeable. And because you're going back to the same time, you're not creating another timeline, if that makes sense. Yeah. But if you were to go to another time, like if you were to go back maybe 8 years, that's another parallel universe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, plus in Ocarina of Time, Link technically doesn't travel back physically. He only travels back mentally. Like, if you've ever seen the butterfly effect, it's kind of like that. Like when he time travels, only his consciousness is traveling back. So when he goes back, he actually becomes a kid again, or at the age of where he goes in that time period. But Skyward Sword,
because the materials go back, the materials he has from the past. Well. Yeah.
Like Skyward Sword is more like Terminator time travel, where he just, as adult Link, walks into a portal and he emerges as adult Link. He's not suddenly a kid or something. Plus, he goes like thousands of years to a time period, thousands of years before he was even born. But in Ocarina of Time, he's kind of restricted to that 7-year time back.
He always goes back to the moment where he switched both times. Like he can't go back farther than the last time he was a kid or an adult. The progress doesn't like reset or go back further back beyond what he's done before. In either body.
So people might think of, okay, so that's inconsistent. Like, so does that mean that they didn't really think about? They probably didn't. They probably were just like, hey, this is just what we're doing for this game, and that's how it is. It doesn't go deeper than that. But because we're theorizing, right, I guess we take on the responsibility of trying to make sense out of it, right? Or just opting to just not try, right? Those are our two options. Like, how does it make sense from a semi-logical perspective where there's two different like types of like time travel? Is that like, in theory, could there just be two different ways to travel through time that have different effects? For example, how you're saying how Link travels through consciousness, but the body like ages up and down, right? In Ocarina of Time, but in Skyward Sword, it's basically like a portal that just plops you into another realm that just so happens to be way in the past.
Yeah, I guess you could say that there's just different methods of going back in time, because Majora's Mask also works completely different, because you only go back 3 days into the past, and the rules are completely different there as well. When Link travels back in Ocarina of Time, he doesn't lose all his rupees and items and stuff like that. But in Majora's Mask, he loses everything except the key items, obviously.
Right, which is interesting, though, right? Like, certain elements do not get reversed when you go back in time, but others do. So it's like, if something is of a divine power, I guess the key items, they stick with you, right? Like, it's almost like in Majora's Mask, literally, it's not just like from a canon perspective. Like, literally, you progress through the game even though you're going back in time repeatedly. Like, there is a progression.
Yeah.
but only certain elements can progress, while the rest of the game is just continually cycling through.
Yeah, Majora's Mask is strange.
It's like Majora's Mask has
it's like you're
two
going to a new
timelines.
time. It feels to me like you're going back, like you're starting a new timeline every time. You're like, yep, this timeline's screwed. Let's just go back, take my stuff. Let's go hit a new timeline. Let's go.
But
That's kind of what it feels like to me.
Well, this is how I'm sort of like visualizing it. Majora's Mask has one timeline that you are just going from beginning to end, right? And that's your progress of the game. But then there's another like side where there are a whole bunch of different timelines because you're just reversing time each time, but there's still one continuous timeline at the same time because that's your progression to the game, and thus also you getting the key items. So it's just kind of weird how like there's just, if you think about it, every Zelda game has like an entirely different like way of like of handling time, and they're all pretty darn different.
And multiverse theory definitely does exist, or else we wouldn't have a timeline split. So that's also a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess you could say maybe if you don't, if you change things in a certain way, you can split the timeline. But if you stick to, like in Skyward Sword, Link basically doesn't do anything that would warrant a timeline split, because at the very end of the story, everybody ends up in the time period where they're supposed to be. And in Ocarina of Time, Zelda, I guess, makes the mistake, I don't know if you can call it a mistake, but she makes the mistake of kind of playing God and being like, I'm going to send you back to your time so you can relive your childhood, not realizing that that's going to create a timeline split, because now all of a sudden you have young Link going back as young Link, and the rest of the world continuing on without his presence.
And that's an interesting point, because Link's not going back the same way he was going back throughout the progression of the game. He's going back in a different way through the power of Zelda.
Yeah, and what's interesting, there's one theory which I really like, is that the Master Sword in the Wind Waker is a replica. It's not the real Master Sword. Because it's from he used to be called Master Nintendo Bandit, now it's Bandit Games.
Okay, yeah, I've seen his channel for sure.
When Link is sent back by Zelda, he has the Master Sword on his back. He goes into a portal and he has the Master Sword on his back, and then he emerges in the other timeline and the Master Sword goes into the pedestal. So where did the Master Sword go in the adult timeline? It should be gone because it went with Link. You can see that he still has it on his back as he goes into the portal.
So in the adult timeline, the Master Sword disappears.
Yeah, it ceases to exist, as does Link. So the idea is that the Master Sword in the Wind Waker is kind of like they recreated the sword again at some point. The sages did. Because I think even Ganondorf says something like, go to those fools inside the castle and tell them their sword is no longer working or something. Or
well, it isn't very effective, right? Like, you do have to go to a couple temples to power it up. So
yeah, that's also a weird question. Like, why does it all of a sudden need to be restored through the sages to get his glow back, while in Ocarina of Time that wasn't necessary? Neither is it in Twilight Princess. It just has its glow always, and it can. So that's why people are like, it's just a theory, obviously, and it's based on a very small inconsistency in just one cutscene at the very end. But it is an interesting theory. It's interesting to think about, because when you make that observation, like, yeah, he does have the sword on his back. Where did the sword go? And how did it end up in the Wind Waker? It had to have been a replica then.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of make sense, though, because, again, the sword is different. It's not... It looks different, at least, right? And we don't know... They never explain why... Do they? I don't think so. They don't really tell you why the Master Sword doesn't have its power in the Wind Waker. You just like, oh, well, we got to make it better. So you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not even the first... And it's not even the first iteration of a story where they try to replicate the Master Sword, because I think the Royal Guard gear in Breath of the Wild was also based on an attempt to recreate the Master Sword's power, but there was a flaw in the system, which is why the swords, the Royal Guard all the Royal Guard weapons, they're all very fragile. They are extremely powerful, but they break very, very quickly. And I think the description says something along the lines of, it was an attempt by the Sheikah to recreate a Master Sword type of weapon.
That's pretty cool.
It kind of failed, so to speak, or it wasn't perfect.
And I love everything that we're sort of touching on right now, because I feel like a number of things that we've touched on already, which aren't really related to Breath of the Wild 2, could have some basis in Breath of the Wild 2, right? Where we're touching on time travel, there could be time travel mechanics in Breath of the Wild 2. It's not confirmed necessarily, but there's a few implications which we'll get into a little bit. And we've touched on it before here, but Don, I'm definitely curious in your take on that. But then also when we talk about the sword, right, and how apparently the Sheikah were trying to recreate that, right, or at least the royal weapons, like there is that, like you see where the Master Sword is at right now. It's completely destroyed. It's more destroyed than it's ever been. Like there's probably gonna be some effort to restore it or rebuild it or make a new one or something like that. You know, so there's some links to what we're already talking about. I didn't intend link to be a pun, but I'll probably use the word link various times throughout this discussion. But let's get back to the chat a little bit, just to kind of like, you know, just like some warm-up theorizing right here. Just see how everyone's doing.
I'm gonna be right back.
Do your best, Brandon. Joy CJ, hello there. Super Chris, hello.
General Kenobi.
General Kenobi? Oh man. Joshua Mostoller, hello. Bingo Bomb, howdy. Evil Iggy, hello there. I'm gonna see if there's any like questions for me to get to.
Hello, Nintendog.
Hello.
Hello, Rel.
MZ Killer 2022. Age of Calamity was false advertising. I never really like interpreted it as false advertising, because when they first introduced the game, they did say, I mean, I'm pulling from memory here and I'm paraphrasing, so you know, I don't want to like put too much stock in what I'm saying myself, but I remember them saying something to the effect of, you can sort of like see the world of Hyrule before Breath of the Wild. Like I guess at first they were. I do understand. A lot of people sort of interpreted whatever Nintendo said as, hey, you're gonna be able to experience the events leading up to the calamity that led to Breath of the Wild. And I think when people played the game and they saw, well, these events do not actually lead to Breath of the Wild, I think that's where there was a little bit of a disconnect. I didn't take much issue with that, but I also didn't like overanalyze that initial sort of like announcement of the game.
I guess you could say it was a little bit false advertising, but you know, on the other hand, which game doesn't when it's launched? Like, what were they supposed to do? Say like, these are the events of 100 years ago, but it's not really canon because it's in its own timeline. Obviously, like I think the biggest problem people have is that it's not the real events of 100 years ago, which I understand. But on the other hand, when you really think about it, it's a Warriors game, and the story of the Calamity is loss after loss after loss, after like death after death. Everybody loses, everybody dies, and that just doesn't work with a Warriors game because it's all based on choosing your favorite character, leveling them up, you know, getting better weapons, which is also why Link pulls the Master Sword way later, even though he's supposed to already have it if you really get technical about it. But you cannot have Link start out with the strongest sword in the game. That just doesn't work like that. And you can also not kill off a champion you've... Like, suppose your favorite champion is Urbosa, and you spend all your XP points on leveling her up, only for her to die halfway through the story. What you lose like the option to choose her, and then you're left with the weaker characters you haven't bothered to level up. Like there's so many technical stuff that we as players don't really think about because we just want to experience a fun game. But these are all I'm sure these are all problems that they had to deal with, and had a lot of brainstorm sessions about like how are we gonna do this, and they ended up just going the easy route and saying, alternate timeline, things play out differently, and it still has to be a Warriors game.
And now you could argue, well, they could have just had a different story that made more sense. Perhaps they could have gone further back in time, and it could have just been about the battles leading up to the Calamity, right? And the Calamity would actually be the finale, right? That's not how they did it. But,
could have been. Yeah.
But the counterpoint to that is, and maybe why they didn't go in that direction, is because they wanted a reason to have more interesting characters. Because at the end of the game, it's a Warriors game, and having more of a roster is cool. So what did they do? They pulled characters from the future, right? So they can have a more expanded roster. And by pulling characters from the future, the story they chose does make sense in order to have those characters be in that same timeline. So, from that perspective, I mean, I do think what they did is logical, but, it is, to your point, it's kind of like, what are they going to do, right? Like, they can't just spoil the game upon announcement either. So it's kind of like a tough thing, like, how do you word it, right? And then there's also different translations, too. Like, sometimes something is lost in translation. So I wouldn't, say that they were intentionally trying to be misleading, because you still get to, explore that world and see how it was before the Calamity. So, that promise, at least to some extent, is true. But yes, the story is also different. So that there is some... It's weird, but it didn't bother me.
Like I said, false advertising has always been a part of video games. A, to obscure plots, B, to sell the game, because that's, at the end of the day, this is marketing. Marketing is very strict, to the point. Only say the things you need to know, say the stuff that sticks in the minds of people, and they will buy the game. It's the world we live in sometimes. And
you ever see commercials of movies and they say, oh, #1 movie in the country, and you're like, but they just said that about another movie last week. So which one's true?
Last week it was true. Just last week.
This
week this one's the #1.
I assume that they're not lying when they say that, but there's a lot of
most big movies are the
context that's
#1
not
movie
explained.
when they come out. It's not that hard to be the #1 movie in theaters.
It's like #1 movie for 35 seconds when it came out.
Pretty much, if it's the #1 movie the day it comes out, they can say it's the #1 movie in the world.
It's also the only movie that came out today,
technically.
But
If you release a movie in February, then you're almost guaranteed to be #1, because all February movies are garbage.
Is that when Morbius came out?
Oh god,
it could be.
Yeah, I didn't watch it.
It's a notorious month where they just dump all the stuff that they didn't get finished for the holiday season or whatever, and or they're not proud enough to release it at that time.
And sometimes people don't want to go through that.
I mean, it's not always a measurement of quality, obviously. That's just not how it is.
I saw a movie this February and it was actually good, but I don't remember what it was.
It's all a blur to me.
Yeah, same. What is time?
We'll hold on that time for now.
The highest grossing movies are definitely not always the best movies. Some are.
It's kind of like the same as games, right? Just because the best-selling games aren't necessarily the best quality games. I do think there is
You mean Call of Duty isn't the best, most highest quality game of all time?
I do think there is a light correlation between sales and quality, but it's not
bugs in that game all the time.
100% either. If a game sells over 100 million copies, it's probably fun. Obviously some people enjoy it if 100 million people buy it, right? But that doesn't mean it's what we would consider to be the most objectively fun mastercraft kind of game either. There's opinions. Let's see here. D Fox added me the side quest Majora's Mask where the timelines really throw you for a loop. The
what?
The side quests. Well, whenever you go back in time, Well, okay, so you do get the
I
masks.
think all the side quests reset, but you get the masks. That's the one part that stays the same.
Yeah, I'm fairly
Otherwise,
certain the
every
events
single
pretty
side
much.
quest reset each
Yeah.
time, right? Yeah.
But like for example, the Anju and Kafi side quests, like
Such a great side quest. One of the
But
best side
there are-
quests ever.
there's a handful of masks I think you need for that side quest, right?
That was
and
pretty in depth.
So is it even possible to like do it from the very first time cycle? Like when you come into the game,
No.
is it possible to do it all in one shot?
Well,
I mean, it might be possible.
I don't
because
know.
There are
Obviously not
speedrunners
the
that can do
very
all sorts
first
of
time, because
things.
you have to go through that intro sequence, first.
Yeah, you
but,
definitely have to go through a couple of loops for sure.
yeah.
Unless
But
you
like the
glitch.
first
The normal
true,
person-
the
the normal
first like
person, yeah.
true loop, I don't know.
Because you
Yeah.
gotta have access to certain locations at least. You cannot even get to Ikana Canyon without a horse, if I remember correctly. So you don't get that until
Day
you blow
3.
up the boulder. Yeah, until you blow
Unless
up
you're a
the boulder.
speedrunner and you know some kind of glitch or something
Yeah.
to get in.
Yeah,
places.
yeah,
Like,
like-
like
I
it
don't-
might be possible, but you have to do things that the developers did not intend for you to
Yeah.
do.
It is not supposed to be possible. Let's say that.
Yeah. That's just glitching the game.
Let's see here.
That cannot-
Giancarlo added me. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 could feature time travel in some form. In parentheticals, Daruk Italian voice actor seemed to suggest Link is going to meet Daruk's ancestor. So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm kind of curious how Don feels about it, because we've talked about it on the channel already. But I'm pretty sure you've heard about the that potential voice actor leak, right? Because there is this Italian website that I forget the name, but interviewed the Italian voice actor for Daruk, and supposedly from the interview, he confirmed that he did work on Breath of the Wild 2 already. And he also did work for Daruk's ancestor as well. And people from that have made the assumption that that means there's some form of time travel potentially. So,
Well, like, I don't know, but like, I don't want to be obviously, don't want to be a downer. But I do quickly want to disclose that I felt it was very distasteful of that guy to ask a voice actor a question like that. The guy is doing his job. Like, if you're a Zelda news channel or whatever, don't ask these types of questions, film them and put them online. That you could have potentially put the guy out of a job for the rest of his voice acting career. It's just not cool. Just for a quick scoop, I think that's in very poor taste. But that that aside, I'm not sure. It's a bit difficult to say, because I did find it a bit suspicious that he didn't even remember the name of the character. Like, if
maybe
it wasn't...
he didn't break NDA, and he didn't remember because that part was
like
under
he was
NDA.
just trying to save his skin. Like, I don't even remember what.
Like maybe
could be.
Because I mean, ultimately, all he said was, "Hey, yeah, I've done work for Breath of the Wild 2, which is a game that's already known to be like, it's no secret that the game is it's not really a big shocker that there's gonna be voice acting in Breath of the Wild 2, because there's voice acting in Breath of the Wild
obviously.
1. The biggest revelation is that Daruk is gonna have some voice lines in there.
I do have a theory on that.
Well, I mean, and also the idea of an ancestor as well, right? Like, some people thought that maybe there's some sort of translation error and he meant like Yonobo, but apparently from the translation that it seems pretty clear that it's an ancestor of Daruk, not Yonobo, the new version of Daruk.
Oh yeah, Game Over Jesse says, anytime we interview anyone, we always go over what to ask and what not to ask before we go live. Well, yeah, that's how a decent,
Makes
like,
sense.
well-respected news channel does it, because your action can obviously, there is a degree of responsibility from the voice actor side as well. I'm not gonna pretend like there's no like he has no responsibility in the whole like
yeah, but why
like in
pressure
situations
someone
like
into? You shouldn't pressure someone into a situation where they might make a mistake either.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because it can have big repercussions for their career in the future, and that's just not worth it just for you to be able to deliver a quick scoop. Something we don't even know how big it actually is going to be, so it might not even be a big deal. Obviously, Daruk's voice being in there somewhere again is pretty interesting. Whether that's like we're gonna see his spirit maybe, or if it's gonna be flashbacks or anything like that. I just hope to God they don't bring him back. Like, oh, he's all of a sudden alive again. We can fix everything.
No.
Yeah.
I don't expect that to be the case. But if I had to guess, like, I recently did a video about restoring the Master Sword. I was talking about like, well, usually it involves sages in some way.
Right.
Maybe that distant ancestor, because Daruk was not a sage. He was a champion. He did have like powers, but like there's a pretty big difference between a champion and a sage. Sages in the Zelda universe have always had like a very spiritual connection to the gods and the sacred realm, and they
I almost feel like champions are like a non-divine version of a sage. Like they're not divinely ordained, right? It's like what basically it's who the princess or the king picks to be. They're basically chosen. Like it's almost like a political thing. Like, hey, you are going to be the champion, but it isn't like the goddess said that's our new sage. You know?
Well, champions are just very powerful warriors, and these also all happen to have a big presence in their respective clans or tribes, or
they're kind of just like generals, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. That's
or ambassadors.
Usually that's also
they're ambassador warriors.
Yeah. I think that's also how they call them in Elden Ring. Like all those prominent figures who fought on the battlefield, they're called champions. But it's not necessarily something divine. And the sages, they definitely do have something to do with the divine, because they reincarnate all the time, and they always come back in some shape or form. In Twilight Princess, they even look like ethereal beings. So it's clear that that's not the same thing. But if maybe there is a distant ancestor of Daruk who was a sage, doesn't have to be Darunia or anything. The time gap is so huge, there could have been like multiple sages since then. But maybe they will help you fix the sword in some way. Like they give you your essence and it's imbued inside the sword, and slowly but surely with every sage you talk to. So instead of awakening a sage like you did in Ocarina of Time, in this case you revisit their spirits, or I don't know.
Well,
it's just an idea.
So for example, in the Wind Waker, when you visit the Wind and the Earth temples, you find new sages, right? Medley and Maker, right? But they interact with the ghost of their predecessors who were sages. So it could be something like that, where perhaps maybe it is Daruk, which would be a cool sort of throwback. But I'm inclined to agree it's probably someone in between Daruk and Darunia in terms of the lineage of great like Goron champions, or kings. But someone like that could just be like a phantom sage, and maybe Yonobo becomes a new sage. Maybe instead of them becoming champions in Age of Calamity, he just becomes this like a new sage. Yeah,
but in order to do that, like he has to make connection with the old distant sage from back in the day. But we do know sages did exist in that timeline as well, because I think both Ruto and Naburu are mentioned in backstories.
Yeah, there's the Zora tablets kind of talk about a lot of that Zora history, I think. For sure. And just kind of thinking about how maybe they could go about it, because it is possible that we do go back in time, literally, and interact with Daruk's ancestor. That is possible. But I also don't think that's what's going to happen. I
think it's very easily could just be flashbacks. I definitely think they want to dive a little bit more into the story of what happened, like when Ganon was first sealed, because I mean, obviously we're going and we're getting the original Ganondorf is coming back. We found out the original place where they seals him. You can see on the walls all the different what would you call that, like cave paintings or cave drawings of the battle. You can see it definitely puts kind of a focus on that original battle where Ganondorf was sealed. I think it was like 10,000 years before the events of Breath of the Wild.
Oh, even longer than that.
Yeah, because 10,000 is when the first Calamity happens.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So it could be 20,000 years ago, it could be 50,000, we don't know. But I am much more interested in that period than the first Calamity of 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Because basically the same thing happened there with the Guardians, and except this time they won because Ganon wasn't aware of the Guardians yet. And the second time he knew, so he took measures and, he pulled the Guardians to his side. But that was not, that was his second time, so he learned from his mistakes from 10,000 years ago.
What would be cool,
but
right? To your point,
we also see the pig kind of like form on the tapestry of 10,000 years ago, whereas the cave paintings, you see him as human Ganondorf.
Yeah, he's riding on a horse with a trident.
Yeah, it's really cool. I'm very excited to see.
I hope the final battle is horseback. With at least part of the battle has him on horseback with a trident fighting you. Dude, that would be so cool.
I can see them doing some flashbacks like that because, I mean, think of it like this, right? So, I mean, you illustrated it pretty well in one of your recent videos, Don, just talking about reforging the Master Sword. And when you look at the history of Zelda, usually how it's done, it's by taking the sword to varying temples and, having, some sort of fire or sage help to restore or power it up, right? So I do feel like there's a pretty good chance that that's basically going to be happening in Breath of the Wild too. And I mean, we've theorized for a while that maybe they're going to be bringing back some type of dungeons or temples from the past. Given all the seismic activity we saw in the first trailer and everything going on, maybe we do sort of find these old, like, dug, underground temples and revisit them some way. I don't know if they'll be restored through time travel, which might be an interesting idea. If there's like maybe like a time shift stone, but just for a particular dungeon, not the world. But kind of backtracking, like taking the sword to these different areas to find a way to restore them. But there is like the phantom of those different spirits. Or if it is a time shift stone idea where it's basically all in ruins, but for some reason you can bring the temple back to its prior time just when you're exploring that dungeon, and maybe in that time, in that pocket of space, the spirit, or the sage is alive then. But regardless, in some way you may be interacting with these sages, be them phantoms or in the past somehow. They can tell you about Ganondorf. They can talk about their interactions with that event that eventually led to perhaps that final falling of Ganondorf, maybe relating to the cave paintings with him fighting on a horse with a trident. Maybe that's his final battle where he falls, and that's what ultimately leads to the Calamity. Now, something I want to throw out there, and maybe there's something we know that kind of deconfirms this, but do we know how much time transpired between the last time Ganondorf was humanoid and that first Calamity attack? Like, what if it's just a few days or something, or a few months? Like, what if, like, we don't know how much of a gap there is there, because it's possible that maybe this all did happen about 10,000 years ago, give or take a couple of years, right? But maybe we still do learn about Ganondorf as a person, the politics involved, the fights involved. We see him fall through some sort of flashback through one of the sages or something like that. But that also does lead to that initial Calamity, and we do learn about that initial Calamity at the same time, because maybe these events are actually pretty close together. We don't know how much of a gap there is between the last time he was a person, or whatever you want to call him, versus the Calamity. It could be a short time, it could be a long time.
Well, we don't even know which timeline Breath of the Wild follows up on.
It's in all of them. It's in all of them.
Yeah, so it's hard to say, because obviously a lot of people, when they think, oh, last time humanoid Ganondorf, Twilight Princess, but then you suddenly realize that Four Swords Adventures is also in between there, which has human Ganondorf. You don't actually see him, but it is implied that he starts out as human, and then he steals a trident, and then he becomes Ganon, his alter ego, Ganon. But this is a reincarnation of a different Ganondorf, so it's a...
But I think apparently there is also the spirit of the initial Ganondorf is also still in that game too. So there's like 2 different Ganondorfs in that game, if I'm not mistaken.
And Vati is in the game as well.
Yeah, that's a crazy one.
That game is...
That's the Spider-Man 3 of Zelda games.
It is. It is. A lot of people don't even think it's placed correctly. It shouldn't be there in the timeline. It should probably be somewhere along like Minish Cap, maybe like alternate universe of Minish Cap. But you know, it's it's hard to say. But I'd like to think that they're just gonna ignore that part of the distant past, all the older games. Something just happened at some point. Ganondorf, for whatever reason, was a Gerudo, and he got sealed underground by who we don't know. And then at some point he transformed into Malice.
Yeah, they may not even hard confirm that this is the same Ganondorf from Twilight Princess.
No, that's not confirmed.
Right,
a lot of people
they may never
make the connection.
Yeah.
No, they may not even. They may completely ignore that. But the only reason why people make that connection is because of the chest wound, where the hand is gripping him. They're like, that's a bit similar.
It's interesting though, because you go through Twilight Princess, there are mentions of like Malice, and you do start to see Ganondorf kind of like start to act in ways that you could see eventually become like Calamity Ganon, because he does have like that spiritual Malice form that's just like this gaseous face in Twilight Princess. So, you know, there is...
Which he didn't do. He didn't do that in Ocarina of Time, so that is something new.
There's an evolution.
Sure. Yeah.
So it makes sense. Like, you could argue that they do describe how it goes in that direction.
I think I did theorize on one of the podcasts that Twilight Princess Link actually sealed Ganon underneath the castle, because we don't see what happens to him. Like, we see him die, I guess, but then he's just... we don't see what happens to his body.
He's a corpse on a field.
There. He doesn't disappear or like get transferred into another realm or anything. He just fades to black, and we don't see what happens.
Well, they obviously pulled the sword from his chest after that, because later in the credit scene you can see it in the pedestal.
They do something with the body. No, the other weird thing though is that in Twilight Princess, the Sheikah are extinct. Right? There's like one old lady, I think, that's still a Sheikah. I don't remember her name. It's probably like, I don't know. It's probably like
Impaz
or something. Yeah. But there's no way she can have a family unless she has like a secret family somewhere. Point is, like, the Sheikah are all gone. So in Breath of the Wild, there's this huge like history of Sheikah, and all the Sheikah, like, you know, shrines and towers and technology, and then there's the whole Sheikah tribe. So is it like, it's kind of hard to connect the timelines, because there's like contradictions. There's contradictions on all sides. Like, regardless of which of the 3 timelines you pick, you can make an argument that it's not that, because there's something that just suggests otherwise.
Yeah. I think the best theory I've seen so far is from the French Zelda YouTuber Rinkudo. He says, like, his idea is that there were a lot of Sheikah in the time of Skyward Sword, but we never actually see them. So his suggestion or his theory is that they used one of the Gates of Time to travel to Breath of the Wild's timeline. And that's why there's all of a sudden such a boom in technology, because the only other Zelda game that has all that really advanced technology is Skyward Sword. You see robots and all those facilities with machines and stuff. Yeah. And all that's gone after that. Like, a Minish Cap goes fully back to, well, aside from some like automata, you can see some stone type of soldiers. But that's about it. Like, Ocarina of Time doesn't really have high technology at all. Twilight Princess is also very medieval in a lot of ways. Yeah. So that's basically his idea, is that the tribe used the gates of time at some point to travel, maybe even
during
a different time period.
The battle between the goddess and Demise.
Yeah, for instance. Yeah. for whatever reason, we will probably never know, and I doubt Nintendo ever thought about that themselves. But it's still an interesting idea because it is a bit weird that Sheikah suddenly they're all there and in Breath of the Wild, but in a lot of other games they're either extinct or we just never see them. So they're either living outside the borders of Hyrule or.
They did get an oddly prominent position in Breath of the Wild compared to the previous games.
Yeah. They're suddenly all over the place.
But then also you take a look at the Gerudo. Like the Gerudo are nowhere to be seen in Twilight Princess. They're also nowhere to be seen in the Wind Waker. And I don't know if there's any Gerudo in the Downfall timeline at all. I might just be missing some details.
No, I don't think so. I think they're all gone. As are the Kokiri and the Koroks.
At least with the Kokiri, we know they become Koroks in. Well, that's another interesting point. That happens in
the Downfall timeline. I mean, it has no other. A lot of the other races are gone, basically. Only the Zora and Gorons, I think, show up, and only in.
But there are Lionels, which you also only see in the Downfall timeline.
And Link Between Worlds. Sorry?
We only see Lionels in the Downfall timeline until Breath of the Wild as well. So it's like, there's just like elements from all three timelines are just in. Like, I think the real answer is Nintendo just said, we're putting it in the future, it doesn't matter. I think that's pretty much it.
That's what they wanted, to wipe the slate clean. So they're like, you know what? Whatever timeline it is, you can decide that for yourself. Here's all the evidence, and it all points to a completely different timeline. So good luck on that.
What I've always liked to think is that so much time has passed that everything that would or could have happened eventually materializes, right? Like, so for example, like the Rito, right? Like there was always going to eventually be Rito like the way they are in Breath of the Wild. But you don't see them in the other timelines because it's not far enough into the future. But in Breath of the Wild, it's so far into the timeline, that happens. Maybe there's always supposed to be a flood in Hyrule at one point or another. We only see in the Wind Waker timeline, but maybe, if you go far enough into the future, that flood will eventually happen, but also eventually that flood will recede. Which is why we see the salt crystals referencing a great sea, even though it'd be in like the middle of Hyrule with no bodies of water in sight. I just kind of like thinking that regardless of which timeline, if you just go far enough into the future, the other events will eventually occur because they're kind of like destined to happen at some point or another. So eventually, everything that we sort of want or need to be in Breath of the Wild will happen in either of the timelines. That's just like my own personal theory. I call it the eventuality theory. Eventually, it'll make sense. So,
Enough time at it. I think it's possible.
And who knows, maybe Breath of the Wild 2 will shine some more light on a possible possible placement, but for all we know, they could just be like, no, we're just gonna keep going like this. New timeline, total reset, and
this is my prediction. We're gonna see a whole bunch of details in Breath of the Wild 2. They're gonna make us guess. It's like, oh, it's for this timeline, it's for this time, it's for this timeline, all over again. It's just gonna repeat the vicious cycle, and we're still not gonna know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure too.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if Nintendo is really into the whole timeline stuff. It feels like they kind of did that under fan pressure.
Yeah.
Because we all wanted there to be a timeline.
Pretty sure they've said that they only consider the timeline like the very end of what they consider for the game. Like when they're thinking about the story and the gameplay, they consider the timeline the very last thing.
In Hyrule's
very last priority.
Yeah, in Hyrule Historia, they say something to the effect is like, this is what we understand of the timeline right now, but it can change. Like this is just, based off the history and the lore, this is what we understand, but it's kind of like, they leave it open for interpretation or for changing in the future because perhaps some facts that we have now aren't entirely the truth or entirely understood correctly.
I think they just don't want the timeline to get in the way of the gameplay that they envision. So they're just if they want to have something be a certain way, they can just change the timeline, make something up.
Yeah, like obviously Nintendo does sometimes make like obvious sequels to other games. Like when way back in the day, like Zelda 2: The Adventure Link was a direct sequel, so there was definitely a continuation planned. But I'm hard pressed to believe that they envisioned that whole complicated mess of a timeline back in the day. That's just something that was born from, hey, we want to make this game. All right, what are the core mechanics going to be? What's going to be appealing to play? Because it has to be fun to play. That's always been their priority. Anuma says that in multiple interviews, also in Hyrule Historia. He even says, like, you may find inconsistencies, and that's just simply because the story is never the main focus during the development stage. It's almost always an afterthought. That's just how we make Zelda games, and I'm fine with that because it also makes it fun. If the Zelda timeline and the Zelda story continuation, if it was all just explained and it was all like crystal clear, there's no room for debate, that's just how it happens, Zelda wouldn't be as much theorized about as it is now. It's one of the most theorized games out there, and it's not even. For sure. It doesn't even come close to having the biggest fan base, and yet I'm hard pressed to find any like Horizon Zero Dawn theory community. You can type in Horizon Zero Dawn theory, maybe you'll find 10 videos, and that's about it. Whereas Zelda, it's week in, week out. There's just, we're pumping out theories like
for some people it's their entire career making Zelda theory, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's not just the big channels, like also the smaller Zelda channels. And then you have the people on Reddit. There's Zelda theorizing going on every single day, every hour, and that's pretty insane when you think about it, for a game that doesn't even strive to be that story focused.
Yeah,
we created that story together, and I think that's what makes it cool.
And I wonder if to some extent, when they made Breath of the Wild and then made the map in the way it is with all the different locales referencing different times and different Zelda games, and they put all these different, there's just so many details that when they did that, I'm not saying it was the sole reason why they put all those details in all the ways they did, but I feel like to some extent they probably thought, well, if we put this game with all these different elements and all these different ways, it's going to lead to a lot of potential interpretation, which feeds the fire of the Zelda community constantly theorizing, which markets the game, keeps the discussion going. It's sort of like, it's actually a very nice, beautiful cycle.
Yeah, it is interesting because there isn't always a lot of variety in certain aspects of the original Breath of the Wild. For instance, like the amount of different enemy types and things, yet they pull from so many different timelines with each of these elements, but they're also very selective. So it does feel like they were very purposeful in that way. It doesn't feel like they were just like trying to find different things to put in the game, and they're just like, oh, this messes with the timeline, I don't care, let's just go, this is what we want. It does feel kind of more deliberate.
Oh yeah, it's impressive how little continuation errors there are in the Zelda timeline, if you really think about how much there is to discuss. Like, I don't want to bash Final Fantasy games too much or insult fans of the series, but gosh darn it, if those people don't know how to, they can contradict their entire stories within one game. So many plot holes, so many things, especially around the Final Fantasy X era and after that. Final Fantasy 13 was a mess story-wise. It so couldn't hold up. And that's just one game, and it's,
and also Fantasy 15 is like two different games that were trying to be one game for some reason, and that didn't need to be. It was very strange.
And I think, if I remember correctly, Dragon Quest also has kind of a messy timeline. So much so that they kind of split them up into just completely different universes, because some games just don't seem to link to each other at all. So doing world building and keeping everything consistent is very, very difficult.
The bigger a series is, the harder it is, because there's even more details to keep connected. It just gets harder and harder.
Just look at how many movie franchises get ruined because they go on for too long. Like Terminator.
Yeah.
Like the stories were getting ridiculous. Every time it got more and more ridiculous, and now they've just completely done a reset. Like, oh, that stuff didn't happen. We're gonna start all over again, and that's usually the only way they can kind of fix it. The Halloween series had the same problem. Started off as just a guy in a mask killing people. Then suddenly he was like this immortal tank, and then he was tied to a cult, and then he was like, it just kept getting more and more ridiculous.
Feels like they come out with a new Fast and Furious every 6 months or something.
Well, Fast and Furious, like, you can't. When you watch a Fast and Furious movie, you just have to know you have to abandon all reason the moment you start.
You're just there for the cars. You're just there to see fancy cars doing
cars
cool
and
stuff.
Women.
Cars and women.
Yeah, they're always finding ways to one-up the insanity every movie. Like, at some point, it's just no longer be a car movie. It's going to be an intergalactic space fantasy magic war. You'll see.
Yeah.
Just you wait 20 years from now.
Space Mustang.
I think it's going to merge with the Star Wars universe at some point.
Yes. That's the crossover I want to see. Yeah. But I mean, it's tough. There's very few stories out there that I would say. I mean, maybe in reality there's none that go far. I know, like, One Piece is praised by a lot of their fan. I mean, I would say I'm part of the One Piece fan base. Like, One Piece seems to have been very well thought out from the beginning. And I mean, there's over 1,000 chapters. Like, it's just crazy how long that series has been going on for. And it seems that most of the things that have happened were planned and foreshadowed, but for the most part, that's not how it is for most, like, actual narrative stories. And then you look at a video game where the main purpose is not the story, but the gameplay. Also, when they started Zelda, they didn't intend on it being a 30-35 plus year franchise with varying versions. Like, they made Zelda, it was successful, so they made Zelda 2. And then so on.
And it's rare. It's
popular back then. That way.
It's very, very rare that stories get that stories are planned that far ahead, especially if they go on for a long time. Even the best of the best, like, obviously Tolkien is considered to be probably the best writer ever when it comes to world building. Even he, like, made appendages and changed stuff. Like, the original Hobbit, the original print of the Hobbit wasn't even supposed to tie into Lord of the Rings at all.
Really?
He made a lot of changes to make that happen. Like, it was never supposed to be the one ring that he got from Gollum. It was just a magic ring. And then...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
If you read the very first print of Lord of the Rings, he actually won the ring from Gollum through a riddle. And obviously that would not make sense knowing what we know now. Gollum would never give away the ring just because Frodo won some sort of riddle. So they changed it. He made a new version of the Hobbit in which he steals it from him when he's not looking or something
Hobbit
like that.
Written before Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the first.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It was the first big novel he
that makes a lot of
produced.
sense then. Okay.
Yeah. Like, his work is not perfect. There's plenty of inconsistencies to be found. Obviously, it's extremely well done. Probably the best for a series that is that huge, where pretty much everyone has an entire lineage described and all that kind of stuff.
I always thought that for the Hobbit that I think it's Bilbo. Bilbo's the one from the Hobbit, who's the uncle of Frodo. Uncle, yeah, I'm pretty sure uncle, because they live longer lifespans than humans, so that's why the timeline's a little weird, because I think it's like a 50-year gap between like Bilbo and
Frodo's like 50 years old.
Yeah, but he's like a kid in like Hobbit years.
He's like
a young man,
older teen.
Yeah.
Well, plus
young
if
adult.
you have the one ring in your possession, your life gets extended pretty
That makes sense.
heavily.
But I always envisioned that Bilbo had just kind of like lied about how he got the ring, or embellished the truth, which is why there was like that discrepancy.
Yeah, he did. Well, he never told anyone what. I think Gandalf did know he had a magic ring, but
Yeah.
there were a lot of magic rings in that time.
Yeah.
Not just the big.
It was one of like
powerful
11 or
ones.
something, right? And and then there's potentially more that go beyond that. This is
you
not a
had-
Lord of the Rings theory.
Yeah, no, but it's just like as an example, like if even Tolkien had trouble keeping up consistency in his stories,
Right.
because it became so much bigger than the Hobbit was just a small kid's book at the end of the
Yeah,
day.
Lord of the Rings
Say
had
it-
like a different demographic.
Yeah, same goes for Dragon Ball Z. It was only envisioned and written up until the Frieza saga, and then they just started making shit up, so to speak. And with Zelda, it's always been the same. And I think Breath of the Wild's reset, so to speak, like they did, I think that was necessary. But because at some point, how are you gonna fix all this, merge it back together? Unless you go like full Doctor Strange with all kinds of weird multiverse. Like eventually you get to a story like Hyrule Warriors, the first Hyrule Warriors, where everybody appears from different portals and they all work together and somehow it mashes the universes back together. Instead, Nintendo just chose to do it more ambiguous and just say, this could potentially take place in this timeline or this one or this one. And
I think sometimes you kind of have to rely on your headcanon, right? I know some people don't like to don't like the concept of headcanon because it's not official, but I think for certain franchises, it's kind of necessary. Like you kind of have to fill in the blanks, which I think makes things more interesting, right? It's kind of like when you're a kid and when you play a video game. I think one of the best examples I like to bring up about it is when I played Mario 64. When you play Mario 64 and you look out in the background, it's like an invisible wall, but you see these items in the background. You're like, whoa, there's other worlds there. But as a kid, like you don't make the connection that, oh, this is all just programmed, there's nothing actually there. As a kid, you're thinking, man, if I could just find a way to break through this invisible wall, I could swim all the way to that island and there could be a whole other world for me to explore, right? So as a kid, I created these headcanons because you're a kid, and that kind of experience made the games better. And I think, when you look at something like Breath of the Wild, there is a lot of room for headcanon to fill in the gaps. So going back to the whole timeline debacle, right? Like, just because there's something's not there doesn't mean it can't be explained, right? So for example, in Twilight Princess, the Sheikah, there's only an old lady. So, let's say it's the same timeline as Breath of the Wild, or you choose it to be. You could just explain that away by saying, okay, well, obviously there were other Sheikah elsewhere in hiding or another town outside of Hyrule, and they came back in, and there you go, explained, right? Or like the Rito were always there, they just weren't hanging out in Twilight Princess, and there you go. Like you can use your own headcanon to kind of explain away gaps, and I think that sort of is intended. Like that's what kind of like sometimes writers or designers are going to want for particular series that are so huge that that's really the only way you're going to be able to kind of actually make sense of things.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's why people watch Zelda theories.
Yeah.
Usually, because we all know that whatever I or Zeltic or whoever comes up with is not canon necessarily, but it is an interesting story that you're telling, and if you resonate with that story or that idea, then you can choose to believe.
Right.
Yeah, you can choose to believe that this is now what you think happened, even though. And the beautiful thing is, it will probably never be explained by Nintendo themselves because they have moved far beyond that. Like, I did a whole video about the spider houses in Majora's Mask. Nintendo's never gonna explain where those houses came from. They were just collectathon little separate levels where you're supposed to just walk around and collect spiders, and that's it. So it's not like Nintendo is ever going to come out and say, nope, you're completely wrong. These houses were actually made by this and this, and like it's such an insignificant detail, but people like those stories because it's one of the few things that were not yet explored in Majora's Mask. And that's usually what you want as a theorist. You want to either find something that's very popular at the moment, like the Zonai, give your 2 cents on the matter, or you want to find something that just hasn't been talked about enough, or maybe you're the first to ever explore it and talk about it. I don't think there's a single video about the spider houses. That's why I did that video. But I also have plenty of videos on the Zonai, which have been talked about by many people. So yeah, that's the fun of theorizing about Zelda, is that you don't have to be afraid. Like, if you do that kind of stuff for Star Wars, you're gonna get a lot of backlash from it, because that's just how that fan base operates. Like, it's all documented and it's all explained, and this cannot possibly have happened this way because we have the stories,
got the receipts.
I still I like the idea of what's his face, the weird guy in episode 1, the fish person.
Oh, Jar Jar
Binks. I really like the idea of him being a Sith. Like, it makes so much sense, even though it doesn't.
It does. It's a fun one. I think some people even chose to just believe it. Like, this is now my head canon.
It's my head canon. He's got the yellow eyes. He just never gets hurt. Like, he's always in danger, but somehow he survives. Like,
he still survives to be just as annoying as ever.
It's uncanny. But let's come back to some more theories here. First, I'm gonna address a few questions in the chat. Having Hope 5 asks, "Where's Ruby?" She's doing great. She just felt like hanging out downstairs with the dog, so she's just having a good time with her cousin. So, yeah.
Awesome. Oh, by the way, while you answer the questions, I will quickly run downstairs.
Sure.
So I'll be back in a minute or so. I can still go on for at least like an hour or something.
Sure. Yeah. No problem.
All right. I'll be right back.
So, Ray asks, "It's so interesting how the famed Demon King demise is nothing compared to Ganondorf, who inherited his power. I wonder who is stronger." So, it's interesting. It's a very cool question. I like to think of it as we were kind of talking about earlier, how if you look at Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, and then you look at Ganondorf in Twilight Princess, and then you look at what Calamity Ganon is in Breath of the Wild, there's an evolution. Heck, even if you look at Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time to the Wind Waker, there is another kind of evolution. It's different, but you can see that there is a development for Ganondorf across both timelines. Definitely. So when you think of it in that way, I think that can kind of explain away why Ganondorf seems so much more powerful compared to Demise. But then it is also a little subjective, right? Because there is the not Demise, but Demise. What's the name of the black beast that's coming from the ground that is a part of Demise? Is it also called Demise?
No, it's shoot.
There's this dark beast that you're trying to... Yeah, I'm sure someone's going to...
The one you fight like 10 billion times in the game.
3 times.
Yeah, well,
but you have to seal it away 3
very
times.
Close to 10 billion.
But I mean, it's a part of who Demise is, right? So it's representative of his power, trying to come back.
I don't think it's called Demise though. I don't think you know about Demise for a bit into the game.
Is it the imprisoned?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but you look at that, and I feel like it's kind of subjective to say which one's more powerful than the other, right? Like, that's a whole other debate about this, about saying which one is more powerful. But also Demise, I think once Link defeats Demise, and he's actually like, he's sealed inside the sword, like, and he's left to sort of waste away over time. When Ganondorf comes, it's a reset in power. It's not. Yeah. It's not like Demise is building up his power, evolves to Ganondorf, and continues to build up in power. It's a reset. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to note, or so we believe at least, that the Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, in Twilight Princess, and the Wind Waker, and potentially in also Breath of the Wild 2, are all the same. I mean, it probably is, because literally within the legend of Calamity Ganon, it's explained that Calamity Ganon took on this form after generations of failing against the hero. So, Ganondorf got to that point. There was an evolution, or if you don't want to think of it as an evolution, or maybe like a continued downfall of like despair and hatred and everything else that just became fuel for his rage and power. So, Don, right now we're just talking about the difference in power between King Demise and Ganondorf. And I've been arguing that with Ganondorf, because Ganondorf has actually been, for the most part, the same Ganondorf across different games, he's had time to grow and evolve. And his hatred's kind of a source for his power. It builds up over time. Versus Demise, he had one game. He was pretty, you could argue, pretty powerful, but dies, and there's a reset there. Well, again, Ganondorf has generations to build up and get stronger and stronger.
Yeah, I feel like Demise was kind of like the pure, most, like the origin of all evil in the world. Like,
he does essentially take over like the entire world, basically, except for one floating island. He's sure he's in prison, but it's still like basically his planet.
Well, if you look at his motivations in general, like Demise just had a very deep hatred for everything related to the gods and the world of light and all that kind of stuff. He was the epitome of evil, of darkness in the world of Zelda, so to speak. And you can also see that in his motivation. He just wanted to see the world burn. And the only reason why he wanted the triforce was to destroy everything. Whereas Ganondorf, he is shown to actually have motivations that are
Wind Waker,
more...
there's a lot of humanity added to Ganondorf.
Yeah. It's not just, I want to see the world burn. He also felt betrayed by the Hylians. His people kind of got the short end of the stick. They had to live in this, burning desert while they enjoyed the lush green fields of Hyrule and all the resources there. And they were basically reduced to a bunch of thieves that had to scrap to survive. So that's already one thing about Ganondorf that's different. He does have a certain humanity to him. But I do think that the longer Ganondorf has existed, the more of his humanity is starting to disappear.
Yeah.
And at the point we are right now with Breath of the Wild, pretty much the only thing that's left of him is that pure hatred, that essence of evil. Which is why he's more like a force of nature now than he is an actual person. Which was
the Calamity is kind of like the pure essence of Demise, kind of seeping out of him.
You could argue Demise is to Ganondorf as the imprisoned is to Calamity Ganon.
Yeah, you could say that.
The imprisoned to...
The imprisoned is like a mass embodiment of his rage. Right?
Oh, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the imprisoned it's like this smoky dark aura that's emanating from someplace trying to escape, right? And we know that the malice, Calamity Ganon, is basically just a buildup of this smoky dark aura coming out of the chest of Ganondorf. I mean, it seems heavily implied by the trailer, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we can tell.
I know some people thought it was a bit disappointing that the Ganon in Breath of the Wild didn't have a personality.
Yes.
It's also what made him scary to a degree, because how do you fight something that seems to have no conscience at all? It's just there to
you run laps around
everything.
It.
Yeah, but now
I'm referring to the when it's just the pig, the final fight where it's like really easy. Yeah,
that one was a bit of a disappointing
fight. I wish
fight.
that thing actually ran Like, I wish they would redo that fight somehow, and it's like a giant beast that literally runs around the entirety of Hyrule, destroying it, and the only way you can really compete with it is like riding on one of the dragons, shooting light arrows at it until you can strike it down with your sword.
That would have been so much cooler.
Yeah,
right, but they would have been more powerful hardware.
It should have been a like God of War / Shadow of the Colossus type of boss battle for sure.
Yeah, or just scale down the size of it.
It felt very. Oh,
I lost you for a second there. What did you say?
I said it felt very tagged on at the very end, like last minute. We gotta have one more form because Ganondorf has always had at least 1 or 2 phases extra, like on top of his regular form. Because I thought the fight with Calamity Ganon itself was pretty decent.
Yeah, I think it was pretty solid. Yeah, it was a good fight. Yeah. It was tough. It was intimidating.
Yeah,
it was felt like an evolution of the boss fights from the Guardians.
Yeah. I do think the blights were a bit of a mistake because
it was way too samey.
Yeah, and because you already fought the blights, Calamity Ganon wasn't really all that overwhelming all of a sudden.
It was
because
like practice.
You felt like you've already fought Calamity Ganon 4 times before that, or at least something very, very similar. I think if they would have done it in some different way, like instead of the blights, just I don't know, something else, maybe like a corrupted version of the champions or something. I don't know, or some.
I mean, I would have loved to just have like
maybe
original...
like 4 unique boss fights.
Yeah,
just 4 unique boss fights.
Think Twilight Princess, for example. Like, think about all the cool bosses in there. But imagine if they were just like, well, like
Majora's Mask, 4 bosses, all unique, all have their own thing that they do, all completely different in their aesthetics. And then suddenly Calamity Ganon shows up at the very end, and you're like, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
It would have had a lot more impact if they did it that way, for sure.
Well, I guess something that sort of makes sense from a story perspective, though, is you look at Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, I think also the Wind Waker. There's, like, Ganondorf is behind it, and he kind of creates situations where you have to fight these bosses, right? Like, they're either like hired help or like he resurrects something that you have to fight, in Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon doesn't have like this cunning mind in the same way, so he's not gonna go around like resurrecting ancient beasts for you to fight. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but I still think they could have perhaps, for example, maybe the malice takes over some sort of organic creature and turns it into something even scarier and more vicious, as opposed to, some
like
sort
of dragon.
Yeah, like, I mean, they did do it to one dragon, except it wasn't really a boss fight. It was more like, help, save me, get this gunk off me.
Which was a bit of a missed opportunity. Because it looked really cool.
It looked like the first time I saw it, I was terrified. Because my first time playing Breath of the Wild, I had no idea what this world had to offer.
Like the coolest thing ever.
It was scary but cool at the same time, and I was just like, oh my god, this thing's gonna completely destroy me. It's massive, and then it flies away, and you just kind of have to get off the gunk. Like, it was still cool,
chase it.
But imagine if there were some interactions like that where you see this ancient giant beast, and you have to save it. Like, okay, that. Actually, continuing that train of thought, for example, like, what if you found like Jaboon or Jabu, like whoever is the modern iteration of that creature in Breath of the Wild in the water, except malice consumes him and turns him into some sort of crazed evil sea beast that you have to fight. That would be really exciting. Or like another example, I mean, to that effect.
They already did something like that in Skyward Sword with Levius.
Yeah, Levius. Yep.
Yeah, he was also infected by a parasite, which drove him.
You got on top of him, and you have to kind of just cut off the parasites.
Yeah, there's something very scary about a being who's not inherently evil, but it's been resurrected or given new life or corrupted in some way, and that's where the intimidation factor of the dragon also came into play, because you hear the dragon music, but it's like distorted, and it's like there's something very menacing. It's like a weird
That was the
remix
first dragon I ever came across, and I didn't know dragons were in the game before that point.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Well,
was
that is
very crazy for me.
and it's quite a shocker. Yeah.
I'm hoping for some moments like that in Breath of the Wild too. Like I want to find something crazy like that. Maybe I find Jabu Jabu. It's just going underwater, and all of a sudden I see this giant whale, and something weird happens there. Actually, we have the 3 Leviathans. Like, what if, for example, Ganondorf, who has the cunning and the wherewithal to resurrect ancient beasts, in Breath of the Wild, they were just giant skeletons that were huge. But you bring them back.
That would be cool.
And you have to deal with them in some way. That would be crazy cool.
That would be very cool. That is actually a really good idea, because it's an asset that's already there. They can maybe do something where the skeleton itself is like half covered in malice, and it just springs to life. We've already seen that he can resurrect skeletons, the stout goblins and stuff. That's all
just on another level.
Yeah, it's just on a much bigger scale. So that would be very, very cool. Kind of reminds me of the one from Twilight Princess. That huge skeleton.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the name of it. But it's like
it's just like Twilight fossil something.
Yeah.
I know it, but
it's a cool boss fight.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
Star-Lord.
I don't like that dungeon. But the boss fight was cool.
I mean, I think Arbiter of the Grounds is a masterpiece.
My least favorite dungeon in the game.
Well, you're wrong.
I thought it was. I have a thing for crypts and stuff like that, so for me it was a very, very cool dungeon, because it's by far one of the darker dungeons in the game.
I mean, that part for me was just a masterpiece, because it's just one, the lead up, right? So you go to the desert, and the desert's huge for Twilight Princess standards back then.
Really cool.
It was a huge, expansive
I thought
desert.
That was awesome.
And you could ride these warthogs, the giant pig things.
Oh yeah, that was cool.
Which was
I love that part.
That was awesome. And then you had to fight all these not orcs, but the moblins. And then you finally get to Arbiter's Grounds. And Arbiter's Grounds isn't just like a basic dungeon. It's a crypt, right? It's housing ancient spirits, evil spirits. And you fight some. And then you get through all of that and you get to the top, and that's where they have like they're like the sages, right? Like it's actual ruins of the sages where they sealed Ganondorf. And you have that whole story, and then obviously you fight Star-Lord. Like, so there's a lot there that to me.
Oh yeah, I like all that. I think all that's awesome. There
and
are
then you have the spinner.
The dungeon itself I find are annoying.
The spinner's super cool.
Well, that's the beauty of Twilight Princess.
A lot of the enemies in there are just super frustrating to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
The rat.
I mean, that's also the beauty of Twilight Princess. It has so many dungeons. There's something there for everyone.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a huge fan.
I did say it was my least favorite, but then there is the water temples. That one's kind of annoying too.
My only problem with Twilight Princess is that it's easy.
Yeah, that's.
It takes away because it has so many epic bosses.
I think the puzzles are very satisfying.
You see these giant mammoth bosses, and you're like, oh man, this is gonna be the fight of a lifetime. And then you beat it like it's a cupcake, and you're like, oh, all right.
Yeah.
I recently went back to Twilight Princess to recapture some footage of stuff that I hadn't done, so I had to play through like I think Ganon's castle. But I just came off of playing Elden Ring. I was like, man, this game is so easy compared to Elden Ring.
Ganon's castle is fun though.
It's crazy. You can just get hit like 20 times in a row. You lose like 3 hearts, whereas in Elden Ring you're just dead after like 2 or 3 hits if you're up against something powerful. So that was pretty funny to me. It's like, yeah, this game is definitely a little bit too easy. I don't think like Ocarina of Time was particularly hard as well, at least not now. No. It was hard for me as an 8-year-old.
Yeah, it was hard for me as a kid, but
as a kid was intimidating.
Even Twilight Princess wasn't that hard for me as a kid though, and I sucked at games when I was a kid. I beat that game when I was like 8 years old. It was like one of the few games I actually beat. Like when I was a kid, beating a game was a huge achievement for me.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. for any kid.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. The kids these days be like pro fucking Fortnite players or something, you know?
But it's a different kind of
Crazy
experience,
skills.
right? A Fortnite doesn't require that much of an investment to play a single game. Ocarina of Time, it's like you have to stick with it for a continuous amount of time. There's puzzles.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that kids can actually use controls because I didn't know. I could like barely even work my controller properly.
Yeah, I mean,
I
I'll
was
tell
just a
you.
dumb kid.
I'll tell you, like, I remember. I mean, I'm talking about years. I'm talking about when I'm like a little kid, and I'm still figuring out the English language. English is my first language, just for the record. So, like, very, very, very young, and just like not being able to tell the difference between like the word cars and the word cards.
I just never read anything as a kid. I just was too impatient. I just skipped through all the dialogue. I didn't care about the story in games.
Oh, that's how I
Like,
am now.
I would skip through everything. I didn't know there was a Zelda timeline until I was like in my teens. So I would just never know what to do because I wouldn't read. I'd never looked at the controls, so half the time I didn't know how the game even worked properly. It was a mess.
Oh, I definitely had similar experiences. Like Ocarina of Time, I didn't understand the story. Like that all pretty much went right over my head. I just knew I had to go somewhere and then defeat some guy, and that's about it. Like, but the experience itself was so magical to me that it didn't need a story because the story already existed in my head. In fact, when I first played Ocarina of Time, I was under the impression that Link would grow older slowly over the course of the story, because the first time I played Ocarina of Time, I didn't buy it. My mom worked at a video store, so we rented it, and there was already a save file there, and I still vividly remember we started up that save file just to get a small peek into what is this all about? Like, how far did they get? And it started right at the beginning of the Forest Temple, and my cousin was like, "Whoa, he's big here. He's much taller." So for some reason, I didn't know anything about this game because it was my first Zelda game. So
As a kid, my knowledge of Ocarina of Time was pretty much just up until the third dungeon as a kid, because I could never get past it. Because as a kid, I didn't know how to save my game. I didn't know how the save cartridges worked. Some of them, I think, were like built into the controller. I don't even know. I still don't exactly know how the saving works on N64, to be honest, because I never figured out as a
game.
kid.
Some games you can save within the memory of the actual cartridge. Others require.
Oh, okay, that's how. Okay, so it wasn't in the controller, it's in the cartridge.
It depends.
Because sometimes I'd swear I'd plug in a different controller and it'd be a different save, and I just was like, oh my god. So essentially, we just restarted games from scratch every single time we played it. So it was just a speed run up till the third dungeon. And then by the time we got there, it was like something else we had to do, and we could never figure it out because that in Jabba Jabba's belly as a kid is super confusing.
It's confusing.
Yeah.
Even as an adult, it's pretty rough. So as a kid, that was like the hardest part. I remember we only made it to Adult Link like a couple of times. Like, I don't think I made it. I think we reached the Forest Temple like once or twice, and sometimes we get like older people would come over and like beat the game for us, you know. But usually we didn't experience that.
You know, it's interesting because I've played through if I would say Ocarina of Time is probably like the single game I played through more times than any other. I don't even know the number. I've done it.
Mine's definitely Halo 2.
I would say a dozen times.
100% Halo 2. It's not even close.
But whenever I do Ocarina of Time, though, I would say the two dungeons, if like I don't remember what to do, that I have the most trouble with are Jabba Jabba's Belly and the Water Temple. Because there's just like a couple things you have to do right before the end that aren't super intuitive, that if you go the wrong way, if you turn left instead of right, or you don't look down, you're going to be going around in circles being, where's that last key? God damn it, where is it? So, but
it was definitely not easy, for sure.
Did you make a video about the Water Temple once and the layout of it?
Yeah. That was my in December.
Yeah.
Because I've always had a.
I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just about to say, like, I've always had a love-hate relationship with the Water Temple. It has the coolest mini-boss ever, which made such a big impression.
Yeah.
But when I dive back into my memory, I can also definitely recall all the times I was just running around aimlessly and had no idea where to go, and I was stuck in that dungeon for at least 2 or 3 days, if not more. Just because I was so... Maybe I was just an idiot when I was a kid, but I just couldn't comprehend the layout of that place. Yeah. For some reason, the connections were not there. Whereas as an adult, it's a little bit easier with spatial reasoning and stuff too.
Yeah.
Like it's easier to make connections. Like, oh, okay, that's how this connects to this.
My problem with Jabba's Belly is because, you know, that kind of second room where all the different holes you can fall into different rooms, I would always forget which ones led to where. And which ones, and there's a part where you have to go down a specific one, and it's like off in the corner. And if you don't test all of them, like it's hard to know that you even need to go down
and
there.
Those damn jellyfish. They hit you and they knock you back, and you're electrocuted, and you have to wait. Like
and then I'm having to escort this stupid, annoying girl who's constantly yelling at me about how I'm not taking care of her enough. Oh.
Well,
and then you have to marry her.
Like something as simple as like the first time you talk to Ruto, she falls into the hole. You go, the game already doesn't explain that you're supposed to fall after her into that hole. That's already not explained.
You think it's a mistake, you're confused.
Yeah, it's not exactly intuitive to go into a hole like that, like to just dive down right after her, because it looks like it would kill you if you do, because it has that weird like moving animation to it as well.
Yeah, you can't actually see down underneath.
Yeah. So, but then you drop down after her at some point when you've exhausted all the other options. But then when you talk to her the first time, she doesn't say, "Can you carry me all around?" She just tells you to go away. She just says, "I don't need your help. Go away."
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and the first time I was like, all right, I guess she doesn't want my help, and I ran around it even more aimlessly. And then it turns out you just have to talk to her a second time, and then she's like, all right, if you're so hell-bent on helping me, here you go. And then she sits down and you can pick her up. It's like the game never explains that you have to, it's not a intuitive way to teach people how the dungeon works. Because if someone says, I don't need your help, just go away.
My first thought is go away.
I'm not going to exhaust her dialogue options to until she finally agrees. That's
especially not as a kid. You don't ever.
Especially as a kid, yeah.
You might not even read what she said.
Yeah, well, my English was definitely. Obviously, I'm not a native speaker, so as a kid, I did not understand a lot of English yet. In fact, I learned English because I played video games mostly, and
that's cool.
Cartoon Network and stuff like that. But my English was definitely not at the level where I could understand everything that was being said in Ocarina of Time, for sure. That's because I was like, what, 10, I guess?
It's kind of like, to a far lesser degree, like, because I watch anime, I don't understand Japanese. I'm not going to pretend like I understand Japanese, but sometimes I hear phrases, I'm like, oh, I somewhat understand that somewhat. Not only because I've watched so much anime, I'm like, oh, yoroshiku onegaishimasu, okay. Like, you know, like I kind of...
I work with a lot of people who speak Spanish, and so there's some things I pick up sometimes.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I speak Spanish, so, you know, but...
Well, that's the crazy thing about kids. Kids can just
speak English.
Kids are like sponges. It all goes automatically. I don't vividly remember learning English. I just watched cartoons with Dutch subtitles, and my child brain would just magically translate and make the connections between the words. And before I knew it, I suddenly understood English. By the time we got English class in school, I could already speak and understand English pretty well.
That's pretty crazy.
But it's not like I remember actually doing that. It's just how a child's brain... It's like, how did you first learn to walk, or how did you first learn to talk? It
just kind of happened.
Your brain is just constantly soaking in information when you're young. You're just constantly... Everything's a new experience. I mean, it's like if you go somewhere you've never been before, you're constantly on alert. soaking up information about it because everything's new to you. So as a kid, that's just how it is all the time.
Yeah, as adults, we have to teach ourselves things consciously. Like, if I want to learn Mandarin right now, I have to commit to learning Mandarin, and I have to commit hard, or else I will never learn it.
It's a lot of work.
So that's a big advantage of being a kid, but at the same time, you're also still learning. So I'm not sure if I would have been able to beat Twilight Princess just like that, like you said, when I was young. Maybe I could. But Ocarina of Time was definitely a big challenge for me. When I beat that game, that was the biggest deal ever. It was like, I beat this game.
Well, it took me a long time to beat Majora's Mask. That was the one Zelda game that I struggled to beat, and it took me, I don't think I beat it until at least my third try. And there would be a couple of years in between each try, just so it took me a long time. You know what? I don't think I beat Majora's Mask until I was an adult.
Wind Waker was the one. The
I might have beat it in my late
game
teens.
I actually beat.
Yeah, Wind Waker is even easier than Twilight Princess, probably.
So
but the thing about Wind Waker is just so many places to go. As a kid, you just get so distracted going everywhere that you never beat the game because you don't know where the actual finish line is. Like, you don't know where to actually go next because you don't pay enough attention to discern between what's a side quest and where you're actually supposed to be going.
Wind Waker is such a great game.
It is one of my favorite games of all time.
I would always sail to the end of the ocean. Like, I need to go further. It's crazy.
It's just one of those type of games where everybody. It's like Breath of the Wild in a lot of ways, where everybody has different stories. Like, because like with Majora's Mask, I at least had the advantage that I played it together with my cousin, so you have two brains to work with, so that already makes it a little bit easier. But with the Wind Waker, I did it I played the game by myself, but
it's the first Zelda game where you can go pretty much anywhere at any time. It's almost Breath of the Wild, but obviously there are restraints. But you can go to any island at almost any time.
You just can't get
you might not be able to do everything
or
there. You might be get it, but you can go to pretty much anywhere you want.
I think even Anuma said, like, Breath of the Wild was what we wanted to make back in the day with Wind Waker, but we couldn't. It was just the technology wasn't there.
That's what they could muster at the time, for sure.
They did decide to do the remaster for Wind Waker HD while concepting Breath of the Wild.
Absolutely. And on the note of Breath of the Wild, because I do want to kind of speak a little bit more on that. There's a couple more things in the chat I want to get to.
Where do we write that?
After that, I also have a question for you guys. I'm quite interested into knowing.
Okay. Let me catch up with the chat real quick. I'll kind of do like a speed answering, so we won't like do 20 minutes.
Take your time.
Catch up with the chat. I'll be right back, and then we can do that. Yeah.
So Joycey J, I know you've asked this a while ago. I'm thinking we'll meet Skyward Sword ancestors, including Skyward Sword Link. So I like that you brought that up, because the other day I'm not saying this will happen. Like, I feel like for Nintendo to bring in other heroes, and not just one of them but multiple, it's not something they've quite done before exactly, but they also have. So what I mean is, in Twilight Princess, you are taught the way of the sword by the hero Shade, who, if I'm not mistaken, is confirmed to be the same hero from Ocarina of Time. So there is somewhat of a history of a previous hero guiding a current hero. Now, if you're saying we'll meet Skyward Sword ancestors, maybe those are like the original sages. There weren't sages in Skyward Sword, but maybe there's like something close to that time. Maybe sages from then. That would be really cool. And if that also includes Link, maybe he is the hand. Like, I've theorized that maybe the hand is like the spirit of a previous hero. And that's what kind of helps to guide Link to find ways to restore the Master Sword, because it's something that hero has done in the past as well, going to different temples, and maybe also helps to teach him different techniques and stuff, ultimately make him the strongest version of Link, because this might be the strongest version of Ganondorf, so he's got to be stronger than ever before to beat him. Maybe. I mean, Skyward Sword, and I guess a lot of people have theorized that there's a big connection between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild too, because you have the huge emphasis on the sky. There is the voice of Fi in the Master Sword, and I mean, they did make Skyward Sword HD, so it's kind of like to Brandon's point of how like they made Wind Waker, and perhaps they revisited Wind Waker because it sort of helped them to sort of concept and think about Breath of the Wild. Maybe revisiting Skyward Sword also helped them to concept and sort of design Breath of the Wild too. Like that, there is that possibility. Does that mean that Skyward Sword Link is basically the hero shade in Breath of the Wild too? I don't know, but I think it's possible. I'm just gonna continue. I continue on here unless you guys want to kind of like add to that.
I came in like halfway through that.
No, I
so.
think you said it. I think you said it well. It's a possibility. Nothing's impossible.
Nothing's impossible, but it does.
Maybe we'll at least meet his loft wing or something.
I'm really hoping for loft wings.
Really cool.
I'm really hoping for loft wings. It'll be so cool, and it would make sense because you get to explore Breath of the Wild, and obviously there's a lot to explore in Breath of the Wild, but there's no sign of loft wings, and loft wings are. They don't exist in any Zelda game but Skyward Sword, so people assume they went extinct. But when you consider this is an entire realm in the sky of Breath of the Wild 2 that you can't see from below, perhaps because there's some sort of invisible barrier that might explain away why you don't also see Loftwings, because they're in this higher realm that's hidden. And we do see the dragons kind of portal through, so maybe there is a connection there, right? Maybe Loftwings are in this sky realm. Like you can't even see you can't see Skyloft in Hyrule in Skyward Sword either. Like there is like an invisible sort of barrier. So
yeah.
The barrier, there's nothing that says the barrier goes away. Yes, Skyloft comes down, or not even Skyloft, just the goddess statue comes down. I think Skyloft's still technically in the sky. Like it doesn't crash down. So there's no reason to believe that barrier actually went away. So it should still be there in theory, like, right? So they could stick with that in Breath of the Wild too. That barrier may very well still be there, along with potentially Loftwings as well. They didn't necessarily go extinct. They don't go down to Hyrule. They're above it. So maybe we'll see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not a Zelda related question, but I will address it somewhat. I may make a quick video tomorrow about this. LP added me. Nintendo updated the Xenoblade 3 description page, and it says rich open world. The pages for Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive says massive world, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 says open areas. Neither call it an open world. I did put out a video a few weeks ago theorizing that perhaps Xenoblade Chronicles 3 could be open world because there was something suggesting it. I'm gonna kind of analyze this a little bit more, maybe put out a quick video tomorrow. I don't think this is confirmation that it's open world, because I think sometimes that terminology can be very loose. But obviously, it's a point in its favor of it being open world. If they use the terminology open world in the description, the
world does look vast. The areas that we've seen, like we've seen some views that looked vaster than any of the areas we've seen in the original R2.
It does look like the scale is very large.
I always considered Xenoblade to be open world, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
It felt
it's an open linear world.
Depends on which ones, because Xenoblade X is 100% open world.
Xenoblade X is definitely open world, and places like Gower Plains in the first one, and
I like to call it wide linear. It's just big areas, but still linear levels essentially that you have to go through and pretty much in order.
Well, like some areas are so big, it practically is like open world-esque, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Like it doesn't really matter.
And plus I always feel like people kind of mix up sandbox and open world, because sandbox is just like Minecraft, go do whatever you want and have fun, and it doesn't matter where you go, you will have fun. Whereas you can have an open world game, but one that also has restrictions, because it does want obviously that's also necessary to a certain degree if you're going to have a story in there. which is what games like Fallout have always struggled with. It's open world, but the story suffers heavily.
I guess, I mean,
like narrative-wise, it just doesn't make sense. Oh, your son got kidnapped.
Yeah.
Let me just go build a farm. Like that should not be the first priority. Whereas Xenoblade feels open world, but it does definitely like push you towards a certain location.
You know, it's funny you bring up that comparison because a lot of people make jokes about Breath of the Wild that Link's just off like messing around, collecting Korok poop, and like doing whatever,
well,
while Zelda's like suffering.
It's to grow stronger, though, right?
You can argue, right?
That's kind of the excuse they give is like you can go to the castle anytime you want and face Ganon, but
you probably should build up first.
You probably should build because Link is basically he woke from cryo sleep.
Yeah.
He's weak.
Yeah.
He's weaker than he's ever been. He's not even worthy of the Master Sword anymore.
Good point. So he is advised to mess around until you feel strong enough. Yeah. Good point.
And obviously, does that mean you have to beat 120 shrines? No, not really. But you don't have to if you don't want. You can do like 60, get just enough hearts to at least be a little bit stronger.
Yeah, you could just talk to Pi all day if you want to. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that did work reasonably well. Obviously, there will always be that ludonarrative dissonance where it's like, oh, Ganon could break free any moment now, and indeed, in the meantime, you're like messing around somewhere.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's a video game, right? So you have to have that. There has to be some level of suspension of disbelief. So
yes, I agree with that.
But
even with Fallout, I can do that most of the time. So
yeah, but just to answer the question, I mean, it's definitely. I personally want Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to go open world. Does it make that big of a difference? Not really. I will say that I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 suffers the most from it not being open world because I think there's some really cool vistas.
I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 suffers from not being connected. It feels very disjointed.
So what I was going to say,
the original was much more connected.
Yeah,
better flow.
What I was going to say about Xenoblade Chronicles 2 to that point is just that there are things that I want to do, and I feel a little bit of a limitation there. Like the example I usually come up with is when you're in Gormont and you see the giant deer head. I want to get on that deer head, but you can only explore like its right back. So that's kind of where that bothers me a little bit. Bothers is a strong word. It just
I think it's also because we were spoiled by Breath of the Wild. Like you could literally go everywhere.
True.
Like, doesn't matter what kind of mountain peak you see, you can actually get there. Whereas Xenoblade obviously is a lot more limited when it comes to gameplay.
But imagine how cool would it be if you could climb the top of Gormont's head, get to the very top, and just see the whole world. Like that would be so cool.
I feel like a lot of JRPGs are like that. Like even the Final Fantasy VII remake, like you can see so much stuff that you will never reach. You will never visit there.
But that's the beauty of open world, though, right? You can see somewhere and you can go to it. I think that's like I think that's probably the best sort of like catch-all term for open world. Go everywhere you can see. Maybe even there.
Within reason.
Within reason, right? Because at some point they're right.
But I do have to say, I think at this, like what you said, it suffers Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but it also makes it stand out from 1. Because I think if they would have just done the same thing again, and you're on a giant titan and you can go anywhere, it will just feel like the same thing all over again. And this did make it stand out, like, oh, now you have all these different worlds, and they're disconnected, but they're all very different,
at one point they did plan to...
Every like Moardane is completely different than... what is the other one called? The one where you're inside?
There's... I forget, because there's a turtle, there's the whale, there's the deer, there's a humanoid robot thing.
It's the whale. I know. Again, I know the names, but I always.
And there's
forget.
a jellyfish area.
But like
I call it jellyfish.
reef
I don't know what it is.
area?
It's like a reef area, right? Yeah.
yeah.
It's something with Aya in the name.
Uriah?
Uriah.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uriah and Gormod, and they all have
Mm.
different aesthetics. And then, of course, you have that whole part
That was cool.
below
Uriah is
the
probably
clouds.
my favorite Titan area.
There's
is
actually
beautiful.
quite a
Yeah,
few
that's
locales because there's also
absolutely
the
beautiful.
the church area, which is like on like a giant bird dragon thing.
That was super cool.
Yeah.
And of course, Moria, or whatever it's called,
Yeah.
underneath the cloud sea. It's not
Yeah.
Moria. That's Lord of the Rings.
Moritha or something like
Moritha.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Moritha. Which is all of a sudden you're in this like post-apocalyptic modern city.
And what's crazy about Zelda
You're like,
Chronicles
what the
3 is that we're seeing signs about all this stuff from both 2 and 1 being merged. That's
well,
really
that
cool.
is probably the biggest like evidence that it could be open world, at least, because all the Titans fuse together to form one giant landmass.
Yeah. The
landmass at the end of
biomes
two.
seem to be like butting right up against each other.
We've seen gameplay where we see 2 biomes right next to each other. Like they look like
Yeah,
they're
that's what I'm
within
saying.
reach that you can walk to. Because you're in a forest area and there's a desert right next to it that's loaded.
Sometimes
in.
you can see like multiple biomes in the distance.
Yeah. But I mean, regardless, you're gonna be able to see certain things in the distance. The question is, like,
Well, I mean, like it's like clearly connected.
It looks like you can
that's
get
clearly
there.
you can
Right.
walk from there.
and we have seen some gameplay showing like a boat that surfs around. So maybe there is some form of
Yeah.
of like mounts or things
Oh,
of that
that's
nature.
cool.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot of footage except for the first 2 trailers. So
Yeah.
you obviously have seen
It's
a lot
in
more.
Think
the boat
they
is
show,
in like
like-
the first or second trailer. It's just like a quick like
Yeah.
1 or 2 frames. So it's not
Yeah, it
like
was
a
a
big
very
focus.
quick clip, so you probably just missed it.
Obviously, it still doesn't mean we'll be able to scale every mountain you see, but at least
Yeah.
it makes it a little bit more connected again, even more so than Xenoblade Chronicles 1. Not as much, probably not as much as X, because X is like a whole different
Yeah.
beast. It's still crazy how big that world is. It's still one of the biggest maps ever made.
I mean,
And
what
it's
if
a Wii U
what if
game.
you can
How-
though? Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But
How?
who knows? Maybe the end game of 3 is similar to X, right? Because at first in X, you can't actually go everywhere because you're limited by what you can climb. But eventually, you do obtain the scales, which allow you to fly. You can get to like the floating islands and higher mountains and things of that nature. So perhaps in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, you do obtain certain power-ups or abilities that allow you to get to even higher places. So, but going back to Zelda stuff. Again, I'll probably put out a video kind of maybe analyzing the description a little bit more. It's at least a point in the direction of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 being open world, and there's already consideration of it. Either way, though, each Xenoblade game has massive areas to explore, so it's not like, oh no, it's not open, big. I mean, it's still gonna be great, but yeah, we'll see. So actually, there's a couple questions I had kind of like put in the description that I think would be interesting to address here. So we kind of touched on this, but Don, I'm just kind of curious on your take on it. How strong do you think Ganondorf is in Breath of the Wild 2?
I think this will probably be the strongest Ganondorf we've seen so far. If not just by the fact that he was able to destroy the Master Sword so easily.
Right.
So that's already pretty intimidating, because if he would have been able to do that in the past, he would have done it. So his malice is even more powerful than the malice we saw in Breath of the Wild 1. Can't believe I have to call it that, but it's just Breath of the Wild, obviously.
Yeah.
I really hope we get a title soon. I'm so sick of calling it Breath of the Wild 2, but that's beside the point. But yeah, I think that's he also seems possibly to be like undead, which means he could be close to being immortal in a way, like a lich, which I did a whole video on.
Yeah, I remember that
I
one.
really hope he doesn't stay in that same form forever.
I do hope he gets hydrated.
Yeah.
I at least want to see human Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild's art style. I want to see what he will look like in that art style.
I do believe
I want to see
that we
an
will
epic
see it.
sword fight, and I want to see him be like agile. I want to see him use like martial arts and stuff. I want him to be like the kind of warrior is almost in like Wind Waker. He's very like agile and he can just like jump around and like maybe not quite to that extent like he can jump so much. But I want to see him do some martial arts. I want to have a sword fight against him, or like we talked earlier about him being on the horse with his trident. That would be awesome. I just want to see him as a human.
Better idea.
Being badass.
You're not going to fight him on a horse. Yes, magic. I agree with that. You're not going to fight him on a horse. You're going to fight him
because we've seen the
air.
Calamity. I want to see more like physically violent instead of just like magically. Because
Brandon, hear me out. Ganondorf is going to use the trident, and you are going to fight him on a flying mount while he's flying around on some sort of giant malice serpent. Like, that's going to be a fight. Like, how cool would that be?
I do.
Cool.
So I want more like I want some like not hand to hand, but like
a sword fight,
close range combat, like a sword fight.
I think that should happen. I think they should definitely go a little Dark Souls.
Yeah.
A little bit. I think they do need to improve the sword combat a little bit. Like, it was kind of like in Breath of the Wild, you just press like, what is it, Y, and you do like the basic.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that is one thing we've never seen Ganondorf do before, where you're like, obviously it's probably going to be a multi-phased fight once again.
Hopefully.
But like Brendan says, it would be cool if it starts out like as more like a duel, and then at some point when Ganondorf realizes like, I'm not going to win this, he summons some sort of beast, and it becomes an airborne battle or something like that. That would be very cool. Because we've never that is one thing they've never done with Ganondorf before.
Maybe he even is the airborne beast, you know,
or he is the airborne beast. That could also be, yeah,
and then eventually wants to devolve into he just completely becomes like true Ganon, not Malice Ganon, but true Ganon, but in his super ultra powered state. So you see like an actual not like
instinct Ganondorf.
Ultra Instinct Ganondorf. There you go. That would be nuts. Be impossible to beat. But that would be cool. That I would love to see something like that. Like, but my question though, right, is I think there's been story signs showing that this is going to be the most powerful Ganondorf. Like, I think it's a fairly easy logical deduction, but from a story perspective,
he's already accomplished more in just the opening of the game, pretty much. Almost killing Zelda, or maybe even does kill her and destroy the Master Sword.
But the question is, from a gameplay perspective, will they actually make him the most powerful? So I guess it's a multifaceted question, right? Because from one point, are they going to make it the most difficult Ganondorf to ever beat? Because that's like, a whole other question. Is he going to
be a Dark Souls boss?
Is he going to be a Dark Souls level boss, right? And then
I
also...
hope like they really had the potential with Breath of the Wild to make the hardest final boss fight. Because you can challenge him at any time, and you're kind of just building up your power the whole time. I feel like they could have made him like really difficult, but they didn't.
Yeah. And that's another point that's I'm glad you brought up though, right? Because in Breath of the Wild 1, you can choose when you fight Ganondorf or Ganon, I should say, Calamity Ganon, I should say. Are we going to get to choose this time, or is there going to be simply a point at the end of the game, like most games, where you're finally ready to fight him? And if we base it based off what we see with the Master Sword, if the implication is you have to reforge it before you can even beat Ganondorf, then it's suggesting that perhaps it's going more back to like previous Zeldas, where there's a lot of objectives you have to accomplish first before you can even face him. And I'm okay with that, right? Like, I'm okay with them doing it that way, because that makes Breath of the Wild still be unique. And I think that's important, because like, you don't need Breath of the Wild 2 to completely outclass and outdo Breath of the Wild 1. I'm okay with them being two unique experiences.
Yeah. Well, plus we already kind of see, at least besides the Master Sword, we already see also the hint of the castle. Something's happening at the, with the castle. If it flies up, maybe it will go to an altitude which is just not reachable for you in your current state. And as the game progresses, you'll be able to gain new abilities, and with those you'll be able to traverse higher and higher up until maybe at some point you get a loft wing or some other flying mount or vehicle, or that would definitely work. But I think you're right. It would make Breath of the Wild more unique if they don't do the same thing again, where it's just like, go beat Ganon, you can do it whenever you want.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the castle rises into the Sky Realm, and you have to make a progression in the Sky Realm in order for you to get there. A few different options there. But exactly. At the very least, you're right, you can't just waltz in anymore. Yeah.
And I think that is also the direction most fans would love to see the game go in, because the old formula of Zelda was kind of getting tiresome for some people, which is understandable after like 20 games. And then like Breath of the Wild did something new, but it also overcorrected in some areas, like no more dungeons and
I want a hybrid.
Too few dungeons. So that it is the logical step to take now, is to take best of both worlds and make it a hybrid between Breath of the Wild and the old games. So you still have that freedom, you still have the crazy mobility that you didn't have in older Zelda games, but it does have a little bit more of a linear structure to
which could help to improve the narrative, right? It's a little bit easier to tell a narrative in that way, which is what I think a lot of fans have been hoping for. I see. I know that it's getting late for you, so I don't want to push this for too long.
Mostly my voice is starting to disappear.
Let's try to close this out within 10 to 15 minutes. Is that good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
I also still had a question for you.
Right, let's do that question now. Let's do it.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, what kind of gameplay options would you guys like to see other than the stuff we've already seen? So not the... we already saw what's in the trailer. We've
don't mention the patents. You don't want me to talk about the patents.
No.
Okay.
Just something like, what would you like to see added to what we already know, or what we already have seen from Breath of the Wild 2 so far?
Do I ignore concept art for Breath of the Wild 1?
So underwater exploration.
Oh yeah, underwater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's in
for sure.
Almost.
Also,
I think
you
it's
already
in every
said
3D Zelda game except Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild, right?
Wind Waker can't go underwater.
Yeah, and in Wind Waker it was understandable why they didn't.
Yeah.
But in this game it was kind of
it's very strange that you couldn't actually explore underwater in Breath of the Wild.
I think it was definitely time issues. They just didn't have time.
It looks like they made stuff under there. There's some like beautiful coral reefs and stuff. There's even like that one chest. That you can't normally access.
Yeah.
So it's like they were gonna put stuff down there, but then they didn't do it.
It also totally made sense for there to be like a water boss, right? Like they had a desert overworld boss. They should have had a sea overworld boss as well.
Where's my giant squid boy from Wind Waker?
There better be a giant squid.
Or the octopus.
I'll be disappointed if we don't see that kind of beast return. Even if it's not, I want some sort of overworld water boss.
Yeah. Well, you already obviously said Loft Wings. That I'm pretty sure that's probably on the at the top of your list. But
but something new.
I've recently finally played Jedi Fallen Order. And,
that game's amazing.
Still on my list.
Yeah, it's so good. But when I see the kind of stuff that you can do in that game, I can immediately see the potential for Breath of the Wild 2 as well. If we're gonna be much more skybound and be able to, be even more acrobatic in the air, stuff like wall running, having a hook shot obviously is a no-brainer for me. And I think Anuma even said they were thinking about it, but they couldn't really, fit it into the gameplay as it was back then. Obviously, Breath of the Wild already took so much time. Just the climbing mechanic alone probably took them many months
making
to
that
perfect.
work. For sure.
Yeah, I still don't even know how they did it, to be honest. It's
magic.
Like in such a consistent way that you are able to climb every surface. That's
Yeah.
never been done before in a video game. Not to this extent.
I guess what's interesting though is that they bring in a hook shot. Like, how do you implement the hook shot without devaluing climbing? I mean, maybe you do devalue climbing.
Well, the hook shot has historically always just been to pull yourself towards something. So I think obviously the climbing was revolutionary back then, but now it's not really anymore because we've already seen
There's still
it in other
limits
games.
to it. Like the hook shot can be for smaller climbs to get you up faster, but if you're gonna climb a mountain, you're not gonna be able to hook shot your way straight up to the top. That's never gonna happen.
Maybe not in one go.
And unless they use the double hook shot from Twilight Princess, you're not gonna be able to hook shot again, right?
Something tells me there won't be a double hook shot just because we see a difference between both of Link's hands. Like if there's if we get a hook shot, it's more likely going to be like an energy hook shot, maybe. Well, I don't know, because we do see the shield with the dragon head, so there may be like more physical items as well. It's hard to, it's a toss up.
True.
Yeah.
But I mean, like the climbing itself was already pretty limited. Like Brandon said, like once you cling onto a wall, the only thing you can do is make a little jump upwards, or you just climb. But you couldn't swing your sword with one hand while you're gripping it or anything like that. There was no other way.
You can't use your Sheikah Slate while you're climbing either, I guess. So,
so like, especially if you're working with these floating islands and stuff like high above in the sky, I would love to see some pretty crazy stuff where you're like clinging to a wall, but you can choose to have one of your hands free and you can use a hook shot to shoot to a different wall. I think the climbing should also have an option to push yourself away from the wall, so you basically wall jumping in a way. Like I said, wall running. There's so many cool things, so many cool acrobatics you could potentially do. And even if it's not a hook shot, you could at least do something like a grappling hook.
Yeah,
where you can target specific things and swing across gaps and.
I missed the grapple hook. The grapple hook was cool in Wind Waker.
Yeah,
I mean it's like a cheap hook shot, but it was still cool. What was I gonna say? This might be a bit of a cop out, but I do like the idea that since we have the hand that seems to be taking on similar like properties to Sheikah Slate, like you have the rune abilities. Because it's your hand and not an item that you have to hold, you already kind of suggested it, it does free you up, right? So maybe you do have more options when you're climbing. It does give you more abilities to do different things. So I think that can combo into a number of different things. So like, I guess where my mind is at is just Breath of the Wild 2 just having a lot more options, right? Like, I know you said not to bring up the patents, but like with the patents, like you see all the different animations with the bow, right? And the implication there is that there's going to be potentially a lot of advanced aerial combat. But let's go a step further. It doesn't just have to do with the bow. What about with a staff, or a lance, or a hammer, or the sword? Like they could also improve upon those forms of combat that are kind of basic in Breath of the Wild. They could do a lot more with that. I mean, Link's historically a sword fighter. I think they probably should give him more sword fighting techniques. At least go back to a level we saw in like maybe Twilight Princess or something comparable. So, you know, maybe it doesn't have to have like 7 different secret sword techniques, but something closer to Twilight Princess than
at least add some more combos.
Yeah, a few more combos. A few more options there.
I would hope to see several different combos, like new combos for each weapon type.
Yeah,
agreed.
And that's what I would definitely like to see. And I just want all these things to combo into each other to create a number of different possibilities.
Yeah, it definitely felt like they kind of undermined the sword combat because of the Sheikah Slate. It feels like they really wanted to focus on that. And they kind of, you know, every sword only has one string of moves that you can do. But we already kind of have... It's not the same thing, obviously, because it's a different genre, but Age of Calamity already showed that Link should be able to do some pretty crazy stuff with his sword. Like I said, different games, but the combos you can do in that game those are not impossible to implement something like that in Breath of the Wild. Maybe not with the hitboxes you have in that game, because it's a bit ridiculous sometimes. But, you know, spin attacks that follow up from normal strings, I don't know, jumping up using the paraglider.
Is the killing strike in... Yeah, it's kind of in Breath of the Wild. Yeah. You do like if you come from if you drop down from high enough, you can slam the ground.
Yeah,
with
you
the
can
sword.
do the slam, but it's not really the same.
You can't
as
do
the killing.
You can't like press A as an action to like jump immediately on an enemy to like just slay it.
You would have to go climb up somewhere and jump off and stab. You can't just like jump and do it.
Well, like in Age of Calamity, when you're paragliding, you can do a aerial swing combo first and then do a stab, like
that would be cool.
Ground pound-esque thing. That's already a huge difference, because the slam, you know, you do it once and you're stuck in that animation, and then it's over.
I think
something else from
really
Age of Calamity that they could bring over is more destructible environments, because you can actually like destroy the Bokoblin fortresses and things. I would like to see more destructible things.
And we do see the stone talus that has the base on top of it. So I think that implies that base will get destroyed when you beat the stone talus, right?
Yeah. I would like to see the fire propagation be improved too, because the original build ran a lot worse, but the fire spread a lot more, and it was a lot. It looked a lot better. In E3, they showed off the fire. It actually works differently than it works now, because the performance was just so bad. Anytime fire would be on screen when the game first launched, they changed it a bit. And I mean, like, we've seen other games like Far Cry 3 that have fire propagation that's like a lot better. The fire actually spreads and gets like really far. The fire in Breath of the Wild is like barely useful. Sometimes you can use it to make like little patches, you know, for the wind, and that's cool. But there's not really like a huge amount of fire propagation like they initially looked like there was going to be, like there is on that. Like there's a whole part on the Great Plateau where there's just an area where you're supposed to burn the entire area. It's just to show off the fire propagation system. And there's never really anything that like, even to that big of an extent, like normally in the open world, that you can start. Fire goes out pretty easily and pretty quickly.
I felt
it definitely seems like they were going to do more with it initially, but it just wasn't performant enough at the time.
Yeah, there's a couple of those kinds of moments on the Great Plateau where you're like, oh, this is going to be a cool element in the game, and then it's never used again. Like that part where you chop down the tree to walk over the chasm.
Yes!
Yeah.
When I saw that in the trailers back in the day, I was like, oh, that's... Yeah, I was like, that's so cool. So you can use the environment to, you know, build your own bridges and be smart about it.
But
and
to an extent, it made sense because you don't have the glider for most of the time. So there's a lot of unique things they have to do only for the Great Plateau.
Yeah. That was it.
But continuing that train of thought, though, right? Like another thing I would like to maybe see is crafting. Like, for example, like what if we can build a raft as opposed to just finding one? Or maybe make it maybe build into something bigger than a raft, you know?
And I definitely think you should be able to craft simple stuff like arrows, like not like huge. It doesn't have to go super in depth, but at least do the Horizon Zero Dawn thing where you just collect materials, and because I don't want to like warp to a town every time I run out of arrows, and they always run out because you buy their whole stock because they're not that expensive. And then they're gone for like, I don't even know exactly what determines that they will respawn. So you have to, if you want even more arrows.
Like, if you have iron and wood, you should be able to make an arrow. Iron, wood, maybe string.
I want to be able
to
craft like special arrows too, like fire arrows, or bomb arrows, or stuff.
Speaking of arrows, though, maybe there should be a few more arrow types.
Yeah.
No, the question is, what would those be?
The ancient arrows might be gone since they seem to be stepping away from the whole Sheikah type.
I'm hoping they're bringing back actual bombs now that we don't have the Sheikah Slate bombs anymore.
But there are still bomb arrows. So, but normal bombs are fine too. I'm just trying to think what arrow types they could bring in. I mean, light arrows come to mind.
Magic arrows, which is basically the same thing as ancient arrows.
Magic arrows.
Except this time they're green.
These arrows are magic.
Well,
Gonna plant them and make a beanstalk.
Fire arrows and ice arrows are already pretty magical.
I was thinking, like, what if there was what if there was an arrow that created a beanstalk? Like, it's like a growth arrow.
A growth arrow. You know, that's actually a pretty interesting idea.
Like, there's some things that can maybe be done with that.
You do plant magical beans in Ocarina of Time, so...
Yeah. There's possibilities there. I mean, if you ever watched One Piece, it's the second time we're mentioning One Piece today, but Usopp he's an he's a ranger, right? He shoots things, and most of the times he shoots like seeds that evolve into like plants, or not evolve, but they develop into plants that can like completely encompass something. So you know, there could be some potential gameplay options with that. It's an option, like what if, like okay, let's hear me out. So, like, what if, like, you shoot an arrow and it becomes, like, a Deku Baba? How cool would that be? Or a tree? Like, ooh, what? I mean,
they can do some pretty crazy things. They've already done pretty crazy things. So, I would not even be surprised if something like that is in the game.
Now I'm debating if there should be water arrows. I mean, you have ice, but...
Water arrows. I guess they could put out fiery things, but you have ice arrows. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe it might be better just to have like a water magnesis kind of ability instead, where you can like move water if you're gonna do some sort of weird water stuff.
Just water bending straight up.
Maybe.
I also really hope they will bring back something akin to the time shift stones. I think it's too good of a mechanic to just put in one game and then never again after.
I mean, earlier I did mention, like, what if, like, in order to go to see all these temples and dungeons, they're going to be so old that the only way to actually, like, take advantage of them is by using time shift stones.
Yeah.
And maybe at first you find a dungeon, you have to find a way to get in, and it's, like, destroyed, earthed in sort of way, and you have to find that time shift stone. Then when you find that time shift stone, the entire dungeon changes because you go back in time to how it was, and then, you know, from narrative perspective, it's like when the dungeon actually begins. So it's like a twofold dungeon in that way, and that way you can actually interact with perhaps the sage of that time, and also whatever was alive back then.
I definitely do hope the dungeons are integrated directly into the map instead of just being like these separate maps on top of the map. I didn't really like that as much.
Like the shrines, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the shrines. Like those disconnected things.
Yeah. I was more talking about the guardians, but the shrines as well. Yeah, they have the same.
So like
disconnect.
When you say like integrated into the map, you mean like when you discovered the Forgotten Temple in Breath of the Wild, where you just walk in, no loading screen, and it's just there. Yeah.
Yes. Especially if they're underground, they get away with it without having... Because the issue before, like when people were theorizing about the original Breath of the Wild and how they were going to do dungeons, is how can you make a dungeon if you can access it from all angles? In Breath of the Wild, they were just like, oh, you can't, because this is a separate place you have to load in at a certain time. But if they're underground, you can have them built directly into the map and still have it like sealed off to where they're not accessible from every single angle.
Yeah, well, I mean, Hyrule Castle already did a very seamless transition.
Yeah.
In that regard.
Yeah, that's basically a dungeon. So
it has a dungeon map.
Yeah, it's on maps.
It's treated as a dungeon in the game. Yeah.
But just how seamless it blends in, because I do believe it does reload the open world. It loads like a very low poly version of the open world once you are inside the castle.
Yeah, once you actually get the map.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once you cross a certain boundary, like a certain threshold, I don't know if it's inside or whatever, but
it's why you're indoors, I think. But once you go out, it will
like the divine beasts were basically
you should be able to leave
entirely
it
new zones too, because like once you're on them, you couldn't just jump off and
No,
go back to the world.
No.
Well,
you can actually, if you're like in Simu, for instance, you can zoom out like with the like free cam your way out of the.
Everything's like
divine beast.
lowest LODs though. It's like barely loaded.
It's very, very low poly, everything, and blurry textures. But you don't see that obviously when you're. They managed to hide that very well, because it does feel like you're on that thing while it's waltzing around the actual world, especially with Vana Boris. You really feel that. But it's just very clever game design. Clever trickery. It's tricky.
So I'm gonna run through a couple more questions here in the chat, and then we'll close things out. So Joycey J brings up, still wondering how Ganon has a corporal body when he'd given up on having a corporal body. So
he gave up on using it. Didn't say he threw it in the dang garbage.
Well,
although he does look like that.
So one thing to consider here, right, is that we are told by someone else that he gives up on a physical form. But the implication is that's what they understand. That doesn't mean they're right. You know, people can be fooled. And obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that Ganondorf being underground, hidden like that, is a big surprise for most people. I don't think if you were to ask most people in Hyrule, hey, where's Ganondorf? And they'd be like, oh yeah, he's underground. You know, so I think most people just assume that Ganondorf gave up on his physical form after thousands upon thousands of years, which is beyond the lifespans for most people. You know, so I would say when we listen to that legend that I think is told by Impa about Ganon giving up on his physical form, I think that's what she believes at the time. And to some extent he still has too, because he's not using it, but the body still does exist. So I don't think it's...
Nobody even knows who Ganondorf is, I believe. Not even the Sheikah know.
Yeah, so they just tell you what they believe.
Calamity Ganon.
Exactly.
They never reference Ganondorf.
They all think that the Calamity Ganon is what it is. That's the evil. They don't seem to realize that it's actually attached to a body where the malice actually flows from.
Which is why it keeps happening.
Which is also a very scary idea. Like, there's this dead body on the ground somewhere, and that's where that's the actual brain of the operation.
What we've been fighting isn't even the real deal.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a specter.
It's just Phantom Ganon, essentially.
Well, don't they?
Really.
I'm not even sure if they say he gave up on his mortal form, though. Didn't they just say he gave up on revival or reincarnation? I know there's like a difference in the
I don't know the
Japanese
exact wordings.
I think in the Japanese version, Zelda says he has given up on his refusal to give up on revival brings him back time and time again. And in the English version, she says he has given up on reincarnation, which is pretty much the opposite. But it kind of boils down to the same thing, because he's not reincarnating.
Yeah.
Like,
same guy.
The body is still the same, still same guy, yeah. Same body.
Really mad.
Really mad.
Yeah. So, Giancarlo Adamy, Link will need to destroy Ganondorf magical artifact to remove it, immortality, and kill him. I think this kind of applies to what you were saying earlier about him being like, what, a licht? Or a lich?
Lich.
A lich. Like, because I think
there's
some
a
sort
fantasy being.
It's kind of like Voldemort, right? Like, suppose the idea behind it is that there's some sort of, like, item that keeps him alive.
Yeah. Depending on who you ask, Voldemort is technically sort of a lich, yeah. Someone who's bound their soul to a
in his case 7 items
object.
Yeah,
in his case 7 items.
If Ganondorf were to be an actual lich, I would assume that one of his if they're assuming there's only one item, right? I'm biased because of Harry Potter. I assume there's more than one, but I would assume that the yellow gem would potentially be his life source, because it's still like glowing and animating. It's emanating And I mean, we've seen him get struck there multiple times before. In the Wind Waker, Link stabs him through the head there. In Ocarina of Time, Link stabs him through the head there. So, you know, there could be something to stabbing him in the head where the gem is.
It would be interesting if that finally gets revealed.
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be a reason why he's still able to be alive. It cannot just be magic. Like, usually there's a reason for it.
Yeah, but even in Ocarina of Time, it doesn't actually kill him, though. It just seals him away.
Yeah, it seals him away. But at least he does age in Ocarina of Time. So they have to somehow justify or explain how Ganondorf has managed to stay alive all this time, or as alive as a corpse can be.
Yeah, I would love it if
definitely seems
Yiga
older
have
and like
something
the
to do
Wind
with
Waker
this too. Because the Yiga have this giant hole. I know how we talk about
there
how
has to be something about that place,
right? It's funny, like we talk about how it doesn't seem like they plan a lot of things, but how there's some things in Breath of the Wild that feel like they were setting up for something. Because how else do you explain that giant hole?
That's why people keep saying that they make the sequel to Breath of the Wild because Breath of the Wild 1 was popular. I have a feeling that they always had a sequel in mind. Because they have just had so many extra ideas, and it feels like they set up for a direct sequel at the end of the game. So, like, with the way the game ends,
and I think the Yiga guy, Koga, he even implies you'll see him again, right? Like, when you fight him and he falls down the hole, he does fall on the hole, if I remember correctly. He implies you'll see him again, and you don't.
He says, like, my warriors will avenge me or something. I don't even remember what he says, but it's clear that I don't know if they had a sequel in mind immediately, but we know for sure that they had more DLC planned.
And they have stated that DLC ideas did go into the creation of the sequel.
Yeah,
maybe the DLC was more story-based before, and then because the DLC we got was very much just more gameplay content, and then just like some memories and stuff. It might have been like a whole story that followed up at the end of the game.
Yeah, I think what they initially planned was DLC 1 was just going to be the typical stuff, master mode and some extra stuff. Yeah. And then for 2 and 3 were supposed to be story based, and 3 especially was supposed to be very big.
Yeah.
Or at least reasonably bigger than what we got with the Champions Ballad, because that was actually kind of underwhelming for a DLC. If you compare it to like Dark Souls DLC, that's like it's nothing.
Or like what we're going to get with Sunbreak for Monster Hunter, where it's basically a new game.
Yeah,
Torna.
Yeah, which was big enough to be its own physical game. So it's I think
like
at some point
25-30 hour DLC.
Right.
Yeah,
50 if you really.
I think at some point they just decided that they kind of just decided this is too big. We have too many ambitions with this. How about we just make a sequel to Breath of the Wild? And because you could already see all the stuff they were toying with before.
Yeah.
Like the concept art of Link having something with his hand which is screwed up, or so they had so many ideas for sure, and they just decided instead of DLC we'll just make a new game. Brendan says, I don't think they thought, Breath of the Wild is so popular, let's make a sequel. That was they were already planning to do more. And that's what that also ties in what you said. They just put that giant hole there in the Yiga hideout, but they never explain why is it there? Why is it so incredibly deep, and where does it lead to? And why can we not go down there to see? You know?
Yeah. It's interesting because if you think about the world of Breath of the Wild, there are some points, the desert area most specifically. I can think of a few, like 3 points. Where there's like
endless holes.
Yeah. So sort of an implication of something below. So one of them is, I forget what the area is called, but there's like this area where there's like a shrine that's like in the middle of this really tall like stone pillar, but there's like a gaping bottomless pit around, and you have to kind of like roundabout up to get there.
There's a Sheikah Tower that goes through the middle.
Yeah, it's a Sheikah, not a shrine, a Sheikah Tower. You're right. right? So
The
there's
Sheikah
that
Tower.
one. The other one's a hole
Also
in the
in the
Yika
desert.
hideout. And then there's the Arbiter's Grounds, where it's just this entire dungeon, which we see the top of, completely underground, right? So there is like, hey, there's stuff under here, or there's like some sort of insinuation of something down below, or at least an emphasis on what's that, you know?
But even
Yeah.
Hyrule Castle, they were excavating all that stuff
Right.
below
Yeah,
the castle.
that's true.
Like, where does that go? How deep did they dig?
And the more they dig, the more they find. There's like this huge thing. And then also the Sheikah Towers and the shrines come from underground.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Seemingly returned to there too.
And then we look at the Forgotten Temple. The Forgotten Temple is in a deep chasm in Hyrule. It's a very deep chasm that you go down. You go deep into this. I guess it becomes almost like a valley, right? And there's this
Canyon.
ancient temple there, the Forgotten Temple. Like, so there are these things in the world. They're like, hey, wait, there's stuff that's like underground here. There's some crazy stuff, like to your point with the lore. So, you know, there's evidence within Breath of the Wild. Not saying they necessarily put it all there at first, thinking, man, we're gonna just create a sequel that just brings out all this stuff. But they have that material there from a canon lore perspective now, from a world building perspective, and they can pull all of that, right? Like, they can literally be like, hey, there's 9 ancient temples that were underground that have now been unearthed somewhat, and you have to go in them some way, somehow, to restore the Master Sword or
Also,
recreate the Triforce.
Also, I've always wondered, where the heck does that dragon come from in Lake Hylia? It just comes out of the water and
Yeah.
just starts flying
I
around.
really
and
hope
like,
there's an underwater temple there, bro.
yeah, like these underwater caves and stuff. Like, that thing has to emerge from somewhere. Like, where does it
Unless
come
it's
from?
just another portal under the bottom of the lake or something.
Yeah, for
Maybe.
instance.
Yeah, it just kind of appears, right? It's kind of weird.
But I want to know what's down there. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
so
we should probably call it a night, but this is one of those things where we can continue, right? Like,
Yeah.
we really are
Go.
just scratching the surface, which is crazy, you know. Even though we had a dedicated Zelda theory discussion. One
well,
last thing.
if we get another trailer soon, like
Yeah.
after direct, we
Hopefully
can
in
do another
June.
one of these.
Yeah.
Another one of these sessions.
Um,
Actually, that's one thing I wanted to ask you. Is
Yeah.
there a confirmation which companies will show up at Summer Game Fest? Because I
There
cannot
is,
find it.
And Nintendo is like
So-
every other company, but Nintendo is on there.
well, that was from last year, though.
No, they're confirmed for Summer Game Fest for this year already.
At the
Well,
on the current website, if you go to like I think either
I was looking at
events
it a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the podcast.
yeah, that was from last year.
oh well,
Yeah,
What are you
but-
talking
so,
about
look,
from last year?
No, I'll show you. I'm gonna show you, prove it to you right now. Well, I'm gonna
well,
share
you do
it on
have you have Summer Game Fest 2021
partners,
partners,
and it
yeah.
says stay tuned for 2022 partner announcements.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go to
So-
those,
So it's just on the site, just hasn't been updated. Okay.
yeah,
so it
it's
just has all the
misleading because
information on there
I mean it's not actually
Oh,
misleading,
okay.
but it's easy to get confused because
Yeah.
I mean I know the
Yes.
first time I saw this I thought it was confirmation.
Yeah.
It's because on
thought that was
there were
looking at
posts
the
on
current year.
Twitter at the time about a month or so ago that made it sound like, oh, these are the ones that are coming. These are just the ones from
Mm.
last year.
Why would they even say that again on
but
Twitter?
it
It's so
even-
confusing.
It even says here, like in Q&A, which companies are participating in Summer Game Fest, and it just says stay tuned for details on 2022. It's like, but it's already
Isn't that
so-
like in a couple weeks?
yeah, I was about
we
to
not
say, it's
know?
like, how can they not know, or at least
3
let
weeks
us
away.
know?
I
No
will say
less.
that Xbox and Bethesda have their showcase
it's like
on
2 weeks.
June 12th. That's been confirmed already in terms of like
June
the
12th?
Yeah.
big companies.
What's
True.
23rd?
Yeah. I mean, I
Jeez.
believe.
22
okay,
days
maybe
away.
believe is a strong word. I'm predicting that the Nintendo Direct is on June 14th. Just because
14th.
I made a little video recently where I just kind of looked at every year during the Switch era, except for 2020. 'cause of
When
the
was it
pandemic.
last year? Was it
It was
12th?
on the
15th, I think.
The 15th. Basically, every year but 2020, there has been a Nintendo Direct on the Tuesday of the second full week of June, consistently.
Yeah.
So,
It's usually when they do their E3 showing. They like to pick Tuesday.
Yeah, the difference between this year and all those other years is that there's not an official E3 show.
Yeah.
But if there was an official E3 show, the pattern strongly suggests that the second full week of the month on that Tuesday, there will be a Nintendo Direct, which would place it on June 14th. And considering that we usually see an Xbox showcase about a day or two before Nintendo's, and it's been confirmed for that Sunday, June 12th, I think,
math.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's then, but there was this recent rumor that came from Jeff Grubb that they might be segmented into different smaller showcases throughout the month, but he can't really confirm that. It's just something he's heard. So I'm hoping that's not true, because that sounds. I'm not actually. I want a full Nintendo Direct, and I want Treehouse segments. I don't want smaller shows throughout the month. It might be cool.
Smaller shows throughout the month does not sound good at all.
It doesn't sound good, right? But then also Nintendo Switch didn't sound good when it was reported by Eurogamer until Nintendo revealed it. So,
I think it makes sense. Concept. I think it definitely makes sense that they're at least doing something big, because there's still a lot of games that are already inching close, and we don't know that much about them yet.
Yeah. I mean, they probably could get away with not giving us a Treehouse footage on Mario Strikers Battle League, but,
No, but we also still have Bayonetta this year. We don't know anything pretty much.
We need to see Xenoblade in a Direct before it releases. They have to have a Direct before Xenoblade releases.
Also,
it
Pokemon
shows
Scarlet and Violet
where they can actually fully talk about
too.
the game.
Oh yeah, Pokemon, of course.
Yeah, it's actually the first full open world Pokemon game, so that's kind of a big deal. Now, I don't know if that'll be like.
And you want to give Xenoblade that final boost, like Brendan says.
Yeah, and then Splatoon 3.
Well, we barely know anything actually about the game. We just know there hasn't been a trailer that actually explains anything. They just have shown us clips, essentially. They haven't actually explained anything about how the game really works.
They are spamming it on Twitter quite a lot, but it's like it's mostly screenshots and stories.
And very basic highlights. Descriptions of this is a defender, this is an attacker. Not really actually in-depth stuff about what's different about this game.
I feel like all those things are cool, but all those things are basically only really reaching the hardcore Xenoblade fan base. And I think if you want to reach that larger audience, you have to go beyond just Twitter posts that are just talking about some minor mechanics.
So, Directs are perfect for that, to build up that interest.
I really hope it's not a series of smaller showcases. Now, maybe he heard something, and what he was really hearing was just there's gonna be an Nintendo. There's gonna be the Pokemon Presents for Pokemon. Then there'll be the Nintendo Direct. Then there'll be Treehouse footage, which that would be a series of shows over the span of a couple weeks. Maybe the Pokemon Presents is in the first week of June, and the Nintendo Direct is in the second week of June, and they also have Treehouse footage in that same week, which would basically be how Nintendo always does it. So we'll see.
I'm at least excited that there's something on the horizon again. Even though that nothing is confirmed, it's pretty obvious that something is going to happen.
It would be I think it would be very strange for Nintendo not to do anything. The only time they didn't do anything was the pandemic year, but that's because it was a pandemic and they didn't have things ready. That's not the excuse this time around. So
no. Plus, the last Direct was pretty decent.
Yeah, no, I thought that it was a great. Good. So for me, whenever I see Directs, I'm always expecting great things. I'm always hoping for great things, but I think I do a good job of putting into perspective. So, for example, the February Nintendo Direct. When we got that Direct, I wasn't anticipating it on being the best Direct of the year. But, I think it did a really good job of describing what's to come for the first half of the year and giving us a few things to be excited for a little bit beyond. They did a stupendous job with that. So, for me, I was excited. I thought it was great.
Yeah. Even if we don't see Breath of the Wild this June, I would
Oh,
still
you
probably
even
be
say
excited.
such a thing.
Yeah, but
Look at you.
I obviously I want it, but
Yeah.
I would not even be all that mad because we still have
I would be
the-
furious.
we still have the October Direct, obviously. Usually it's in October, right?
September.
I don't care. Like
Oh, September.
Yes, yeah, close enough.
middle
With
of
that
the year
time.
direct, that big event is where they should show Zelda. It's where they've always shown Zelda.
I agree. I
And
agree.
they
It
need to
would be
show
the
it.
best.
I think they.
It would be the best option,
It would
especially
just,
if it is indeed launching in spring, which could mean anything somewhere
Yeah.
between March and May.
Yeah, but it probably means March, unless they delay it, because that's when the
I
fiscal
hope-
year ends.
Yeah.
I really hope
Yeah.
so. I hope it's a Breath of the Wild anniversary release.
What's funny though is that they could. I mean, they could absolutely. They can do that, right? Because the anniversary is in February, so that's a very close window. They could totally mark an anniversary celebration there. I mean,
Yeah.
they've marked an anniversary celebration in November, a half a year removed, so they could definitely do that for sure. But what was I gonna say?
March 3rd was the
Yeah,
And
you,
then
you mean Breath of the Wild.
Oh, I thought you meant the
He's
Zelda
saying Breath of the
anniversary.
Wild's anniversary.
Well,
not
you know
the
what?
Zelda
They could do
anniversary.
Switch anniversary, Breath of the Wild anniversary, and just
Yeah.
Zelda.
Yeah, I just
anniversary.
mean it
Yeah.
would be cool if they release it on the exact same day Breath of the
It's
Wild day.
possible.
Yeah.
I will say though, to the other point of it potentially not coming out in March, spring does technically extend all the way out until June, which to me is bogus.
Yeah, but
but-
big games don't really come out between March and June that
No.
much.
I
like
think
huge
it's coming.
tentpole
I think
releases.
I'm pretty certain it's coming out March unless it's getting delayed again,
Yeah.
which is definitely a possibility.
Between
It
April
is-
and June, I mean.
Yeah.
Like
That has
after
definitely
March.
become a possibility now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But
you know,
we'll see. It all depends on what we will see and if we see it this summer, or rather next month.
yeah.
Yeah.
If they have like a trailer on the level of the last Breath of the Wild trailer, like huge, big, epic, and they show a lot more, then I'm confident that they will. They have finally reached that point.
I
Plus
would
we
feel
have,
like
of
that
course-
there's a good chance that the game's actually pretty much done, because if we're getting voice actors already doing voice work,
I was about to say
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's
Uh,
usually the last step because that's where you do the animation for the mouth has to be finished,
which
before you
implies
get
that the
to that
cutscenes are
point.
done already.
It definitely seems
Yeah.
like some maybe performance or some kind of bugs or something like
Or
that.
they're delaying
was
it
the
for
issue,
Switch
rather
hardware.
than- Oh,
Lots
fuck,
of testing, lots of
that.
trying things out.
Yeah.
I definitely think that they are probably in the testing, polishing phase of the development. I
I'm
don't think they're
confident that
still-
if they wanted to release it this year, like absolutely had to, that they could release it and it would work. I just don't think it'd be
Yeah.
up to the level of polish that they want it to be at.
Yeah, and knowing Nintendo, that's what they always go for. It's called Nintendo polish for a
I mean,
reason,
they've
and-
seen games succeed so well in March, they were probably like, well, we can do this in March, right? We have Pokemon, and we'll see what else they have.
Yeah, because
for the
some people
holidays.
claim like, oh, they delayed it because of Elden Ring. I'm like, that if that is what you think, then you don't know anything about Nintendo.
What do you mean?
Yeah,
It came
Nintendo
out
does.
early in the year.
Yeah, like Nintendo also has never cared about what other developers do. They've never cared about winning Game of the Year, and even if it did release this year, it probably would have been December, and it wouldn't have been eligible for Game of the Year anyway.
Yeah.
So that's
been
not
December.
the reason.
Also, I don't think it would necessarily impact sales that much because,
Nah.
I mean, you look at situations like Pokemon Brilliant Diamond Shiny Pearl comes out in November, Pokemon Legends Arceus comes out January, and it's on pace to be one of the best selling. Both are on pace to be some of the best selling games ever on Nintendo. So, like, you know, I think
Yeah.
that Breath of the Wild being on a different platform, if it comes out 8 months, 9 months after Elden Ring, I don't really think they're worried at all about
No.
sales, right? When they can release on their own
They probably
platform
didn't
two
even cross
games of
the
the
line.
same franchise 2
Yeah.
months apart.
Well, people are already jumping over to different games now. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, there are people who are still playing Elden Ring, but most people who really, really cared about it they've moved on. But
you can only play a single player game so many times until you get to move on.
Once you get to new plus like 24, at some point you have to move on with your life and do something else.
I legit saw somebody on Twitter who said they were starting their 10th playthrough, and I was like, my god.
And I haven't even done New Game Plus yet.
I haven't even started the game.
You could also argue that if Breath of the Wild 2 came out this year, there would be a lot of conversation comparing them, which could go in its favor. You know, in terms of just having conversation, the popularity of the game. So I don't think that Nintendo. It's your point, your initial point, Don. Nintendo doesn't care. Like, even ignoring everything else you mentioned, Nintendo just does what they do, and they're usually fine.
Unless if they win Game of the Year, they're just like, oh, okay, cool. It's not like that.
Glad you thought our game was as good as we thought it was.
Yeah, but it's not. They're not actively aiming to compete or to win anything. They just well, obviously they want the sales.
Yeah.
Which they will get anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you look how Pokemon does. I could see Breath of the Wild 2 maybe competing with Breath of the Wild 1. We might not see the numbers come initially, but you know, if there's like a Switch 2 and there's like a 4K version, they have like I could see Breath of the Wild 2 getting close 5-10 years from now.
That's the only thing I don't want to discuss today. I don't want to talk about Switch Pro.
We don't have
every time it comes up
again. Can of worms.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying that I think eventually there will be new hardware, and I think Breath of the Wild 2 will probably run better on it. So there's something they could do there. I'm over exaggerating, obviously, but it's just something I don't know anything about. Yeah,
because I already saw people saying like, "Oh, the shadows in the new footage looks like it could not run on the Wii." It's like, it could also just be a tech demo kind of thing.
Yeah, or just it's a cutscene. So
yeah, it's pre-rendered. Like, it doesn't have to run in.
Or maybe it's just Nintendo magic, and they are pretty good at making games look good. So
yeah,
true.
I mean, like the game looking better than the original shouldn't be surprising,
because it was made on Wii U.
The original was made for the Wii U and then ported over like a few months hurriedly, and like ran terribly when it first came out too.
Right,
compared to how it runs now.
They definitely will be able to understand the engine much better now. Yeah. They have the experience with it from the first game. I mean, they brought on Monolith Soft for a reason. They had no idea how to do what they wanted to do.
They're also really good at making clouds after Xenoblade 2. So, like, I heard someone talk about how like the volumetric clouds in Breath of the Wild 2 might not be possible on Switch, but they did it on Xenoblade 2 in 2017. So,
it's all about budgeting your games around certain effects about what you want to do. Things are possible. Maybe not every single effect that you've ever seen in every game all at once, but just because there's a certain effect that they're using or a certain quality for something doesn't necessarily mean the Switch can't run it if there are other cuts made.
Yeah, it's all how you do it. So we definitely have to close things out because Dawn has to go to sleep. Actually, we have to go to sleep. So, Josh Coleman did at me here. Also, the update trailer looks better than the original E3 trailer. Same thing happened with God of War Ragnarok. The accessibility trailer shows some major graphical changes. Looks great. If you're talking about Breath of the Wild, you're talking about the Breath of the Wild trailers?
I would say it's the opposite. I think the first trailer they showed looked a lot more polished, but I think it's because they showed pretty much all, except the overworld pan shot, it was pretty much all like new content. And it seems like the sky part seems it looks a lot better than the base game, because it's all new assets. Whereas the older stuff doesn't.
I just don't think we've seen enough to really say.
Yeah, we haven't seen it enough
with a lot of certainty. Because sometimes some areas just look better than others, and that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, Josh Cummins referring to the update little splice of footage we got. So you're talking about the cutscenes we saw of the sky look better than...
Oh, I know what he's talking about, yeah. The same thing that it's the same clip that Digital Foundry was referring to when they said that out of context clip that people kept sharing around.
Yeah, I think it's. I
It's
just
not
need
a
to see
big
more.
deal.
I just need to see more of the game. Last thing. This is not much explanation. Just say it. Is Zelda dead?
No.
Half.
Half dead.
Half?
I think she's spirit. She might be Spirit Tracks dead.
Oh no. Let's go.
So, her soul might be separated, but she's still obviously, she can still be saved.
Yeah.
Like it's not permanent. I just think it's a bit weird that there's a yellow-green or a yellow orb, whereas the hand is green. So doesn't seem to be necessarily connected to the arm. And the only thing I know that always emits yellow energy, even when it's the very first thing you see in Breath of the Wild, like that yellow light.
The yellow light. So you think it might be
Triforce?
Zelda using her divine power to communicate. Maybe.
Yeah, so
her power is linked to the Triforce, even though they don't refer to that at all. Apparently, it doesn't seem like they even know what the Triforce is. Yeah. But that is her divine power. She uses the Triforce.
It could be.
There's a couple of Triforce depictions in Hyrule Castle, but I think it's more.
It could also be another.
Point.
It could be another spirit of divine power. It doesn't have to be Zelda.
Could also be, of course. You also had the light spirits in Twilight Princess.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yellow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it definitely doesn't have to be, but I don't know. The fact that they're keeping it so on the down low, what actually happens to her?
It's definitely something. I mean, there's something going on there. It's like, and also it doesn't Link look back, right? With what's he looking at?
Sword.
Okay, so there's some.
I thought he was just looking at the sword because it's glowing blue. So he's like, and then he pulls it out, and then you see that it's damaged. But it definitely is something that seems to be hovering in front of him and talking to him in some way or communicating.
Yeah, there's definitely some communication going on. I bet if we saw a whole cutscene, there's actually dialogue from somewhere. Well, it's possible there's no dialogue. But I think there might be, it could just be a light.
I think there's definitely dialogue in those cutscenes at some point.
I mean, it could be Link is silent. It could just be, hey, the light's glowing. Link's like, okay, my sword's glowing. Puts the sword in the light, and it looks better. They could do that. But I do think probably there is dialogue. We know there's dialogue in the game. There's no doubt that there's cutscenes and dialogue. There's no doubt. I was just suggesting there's a possibility that one specific scene might not have dialogue because we don't know if that yellow orb is. It might be a spirit. It probably is some sort of spirit, but does the spirit talk? It may not talk. It may just be glowing, and you shove your sword.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
So
could be, yeah. I don't know, but it's interesting to think about.
Maybe it starts off as that little gaseous light, but then it turns into something more physical, And it's an actual character that we can have with a face and it talks and things. Maybe it's Daruk's ancestor.
Well, I was just a bit confused to see that it's yellow. I was expecting if there was a spirit inside that arm thing or bracelet, whatever he has, that it would be green, but it turns out yellow, which kind of threw me off, which is why I was like, maybe it's something to do with Zelda's spirit.
Zelda speaking through that.
Maybe, it could also be just her communicating with him, astral projecting while she's trapped somewhere. So it definitely doesn't have to mean she's actually dead, but she could at least be trapped somewhere.
The stone that Tetra gives you in Wind Waker that she communicates
with
you with.
Yeah, I actually said that too to Conrad from Commonwealth Realm. I was like, that was the only thing I could think of that kind of does the same thing.
Well, how cool would it be? Let's just assume that cutscene has nothing to do with Zelda communicating with us, and she actually finds a stone like that underground, and Link finds a corresponding one, and that's how they start communicating. Like he just like maybe he sees a rock and he hears a whisper. He grabs the walk and he realizes the whisper is from Zelda.
I'm pretty sure they're not going to do the same thing where Zelda's like absent for most of the game. There will be communication between the two. Whatever did happen to Zelda, I'm sure they're not going to keep her gone.
Yeah.
I
hope so, because it's just I don't want them to do the same thing. I don't want them to have the same trope of, oh man, the princess is stuck somewhere, go save her. I'm okay with her if there's like a moment or two where Link has to save her, that's fine. But like I don't want her to just be the damsel for most of the game. I want her to have some sort of active role. Even if she's like, and by active, I don't mean like we necessarily have to play as her, like that would be cool. But just us knowing that she's actually getting stuff done throughout the story.
Yeah, that she's helping you throughout the story.
Yeah.
Like Spirit Tracks, for example.
Because she's dead.
Because well, maybe. But like, because in Breath of the Wild, she only talks at the very, very beginning. And then you don't ever see or hear from her again until the very, very end. Which was
excluding flashbacks.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that, right? Because it's just true, though, right? Throughout your entire adventure, you don't really communicate with her, but you don't feel that way because you see the flashbacks.
Yeah.
And I actually do love it because depending on how many flashbacks, right? When you see her, she's like, "Do you remember?" Right? And if you got all the flashbacks, you do. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But we gotta call it a night, guys. Thank you everyone for coming by, and make sure to check out Don's channel, Monster Maze, if you haven't already. It's linked in the description below. Like the stream, be very much appreciated. Josh, I will ask your question, what games I've been playing lately. I've been playing Okami HD and Dragon Ball Fighters. I'm
playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Call of Duty Vanguard, and Halo Infinite.
Have you been playing anything lately, Don?
Well, like I said, I just finished Jedi Fallen Order 2 days ago. So I'm and now I'm working on a video. So no games until I finish my current projects. Yeah. Maybe I'll pick up Kirby next.
It's really good. I loved Kirby. Awesome.
I gotta get me a Switch.
Yeah, actually, I started playing Kirby 64 Crystal Shards again because they released it on N64 Online. So I'm playing that too. But definitely try Star Allies. It's really good. Not Star Allies. I take it back. Star Allies is terrible.
Star Allies.
Forgotten Land.
Forgotten Land. I was about to say that's not the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will definitely give it a try. I can at least try the demo first.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure it's going to be good either way.
It's a good game.
Because I heard too many good things about it.
Yeah. I really enjoy
but like I said, I have to wait at least a week before I pick up a new game, because once I pick up a game, I want to keep playing, and that does not compute with my channel.
I hear what you're saying there. I've been mostly I mentioned I've been playing Okami, but I'm kind of playing it like every once in a while. And Dragon Ball Fire is just like a pick up and play thing, right? It's not like a narrative that I have to follow.
Yeah,
that's how the games I'm playing are right now.
It's like Smash Brothers for me.
Right.
I can just always pick up, play a few matches, and then it's good.
Exactly. So when Xenoblade Chronicles 3 comes out, I have to I gotta get stuff done before, and
yes,
So
that game will consume me for at least a week or two.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah, I'll have a lot of sleepless nights. But that's all for now, everyone. Yes, Joycey, Zelda is not entirely a damsel. She gets a lot done, but I just don't want her to be trapped in Ganondorf's clutches throughout the entire game, because that's basically what was happening in Breath of the Wild 1. She was holding Ganon back, but point is, she was kind of not actually part of the current events. I want her to be a part of the current events this time around, to do something different. But guys, thank you so much. We'll see you all really soon. Take care.
Bye, guys.